Welcome back, everyone. We're so thrilled to have you all tune into the 2021 China Institute Executive Summit. We're in the business, as you know, of explaining China and building bridges between the US and China, and we really believe that this mission is more important than ever. So before we get started today, I wanted to give some big thank yous to our supporters and sponsors. You just saw a video by Broad Group, and we want to thank Broad Group so much. Broad is one of China's most sustainable companies, and is really helping ensure that our new Center for Contemporary China will have clean air circulating at all times. Thank you also to Bank of China, which is celebrating its 40th anniversary here in New York with a series of major new sustainability initiatives that we will talk about later. And thank you also to Tronex, which has been working so hard during the pandemic crisis to ensure that the world has PPE to protect frontline workers and the general public. And finally, thank you to all of our corporate members, Citigroup, Dorsey, First Republic Bank, Hai-Tos, Gemdale, Morgan Stanley, Philip Morris, United Airlines, Tangyue, Wanxiang, and Vanke. We really, truly couldn't do what we do without your support. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Today, we're very excited to be hearing from some of the smartest thinkers in Hong Kong, Beijing, Shanghai, Changsha, Chicago, Seattle, and New York. And wherever possible, just so you know, we will be taking questions from the audience. So please type your questions in by clicking on the icon, the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens, and type them early so that we can get to them, because we have a jam-packed schedule and we won't be able to wait for the questions to come in. So let's get going. I am honored to introduce our keynote conversation with Ronnie Chan, the chairman of Hang Lung Properties, who has played a key role in bridging East and West for many years and has a very, very deep understanding of how China works. I have known Ronnie for more than 25 years, since I was reporting in Hong Kong for Newsweek magazine, and I can assure you that his views and insights never fail to challenge conventional wisdom. Ronnie believes above all in dialogue, and he has worked very hard over the years to keep East-West dialogue open. And as Wang Huiyao yesterday set the stage by saying, let's talk. And that's what Ronnie is all about, is keeping the conversation going. So we are very, very grateful to have him today with us to share his insights on China. And our president, James Heimowitz, will have a conversation with Ronnie for about 20 minutes or so, and then we will try to take a few questions at the end. So please, as I said, type your questions into the Q&A section. And now over to you, James.
Thank you so much, Dinda, for that lovely introduction. And Ronnie, welcome. Please turn on your camera now. We're so delighted. Good evening, and welcome from Hong Kong, and thank you for that kind introduction, Dinda. I too know we are really fortunate to be able to get the wisdom and words from Ronnie. And I thought that now that we've had that introduction, I'd just dive right in. I know that you know that I personally believe the US and China are probably the two most important countries now, and probably this planet's most consequential bilateral relationship. You really have unique insight into both cultures and business systems. You understand that we're facing really tough times now. And I'm just curious, what do you think it's going to take to have a more functional and more productive bilateral relationship?
Well, James, first of all, we have to figure out where did the problem begin? I believe that it began by America losing self-confidence and increasingly seeing China as a threat. You and I and Dinda, we all have been trying for the last 30 years, 40 years, trying to better US-China relations, preventing America from seeing China as an enemy, because it ought not to be, and it is not. But unfortunately, the problem that we're facing today is not something that started with Trump. Trump was just a last step. It was really 30 years in the making, starting with, perhaps if I were to date it, to the fall of the Berlin Wall. And so it is a really tough situation I've not seen for a long time. And I suppose that makes your work and mine even more important. Hopefully keep the dialogue going.
So I don't know, it sounds to me, I also think it's about trust. And I think that trust has evaporated. And like you said, I think China Institute's in the business of trying to build trust. And we do that through the basic building blocks, getting people to have some insight into China through culture, through language, through its humanity. I know all the philanthropic work you've done, whether it's with Forbidden City, with so many of the different projects you're involved in. I know you believe that too. One of the impressions that I think Americans have is that China's a very oppressive place, that the people live there are somehow hoping to be liberated from a very repressive government. And I even had somebody ask me to equate it and said, do people living in Hong Kong now feel like the women of Afghanistan feel living under the Taliban? And to me, this is a very worrisome analogy. And I'm just curious if you can give some people some on the ground color and insight. Is that the way that people in China really feel?
Well, James, first of all, I would like to turn the question around and let you answer it, because you live in the mainland of China. I never lived in the mainland of China. I've always been living in Hong Kong or the US. And you tell me whether when you lived there, you felt that the people feel very much oppressed. The first thing we should know about US-China relations today is that don't read US media. Don't read US newspaper. It is all political talk. Remember what Clinton said to George H.W. Bush? It is economy, stupid, right? Today, it is all politics, stupid. So if you were to trust everything that you read in the media, you are dead. You have no idea of what's going on in the mainland of China. China is not perfect, that's for sure. But on the other hand, let me also tell you, and you know it very well, and Dinda as well, and that is over the last 30 years of the economic open and reform, that the livelihood of the people of China has really improved. Recently, a friend of mine from Hong Kong, who has a home in Shanghai for business, and he went there for a year or so, and he came back to Hong Kong. He invited me to dinner, and he said, you know what, Ronnie? The people in China today are really, really happy. Now, how come the West have the impression that China is a very oppressive place, people are trying to get out? Well, there are always those few people, right? But the bulk of the Chinese people are not like that. So I always tell my friends this. It is one thing to, for political reasons, tell a lie and mislead your own people. But let us make sure that we don't mislead ourselves. We should not lie to others, and so much the less we should lie to ourselves. And you know, the reality is, if any of you have been to mainland China, my audience, you will tell the people there are very overall quite happy today, and perhaps more so than in the last 30, 40, or 100 years or 300 years. China has had a pretty tough time. So I think that, you know, it's one thing to, for political reasons, tell a lie to people that, hey, China people is really oppressed, they want to get out. The reality on the ground is perhaps the exact opposite.
Interesting. You asked me, I think, you know, perhaps that's because, you know, there's always going to be people who are disaffected. And I think that if you ask in America, we have more opportunity to engage and interact with the disaffected. But those who are not disaffected are still staying in China. They're going about their business. And so maybe we don't have the opportunity to hear their perspective in the same way. But I'd be just curious, because you know, you've been at that sort of intersection with Hong Kong as well. Does that apply to Hong Kong? Do you think that the people in Hong Kong are feeling similarly optimistic and good these days?
Nope, unfortunately not. And the reason is very simple. A small group of people who wanted to see the change of government in Hong Kong, because they are really not against Hong Kong per se, they're really against Beijing, and Hong Kong became just a pawn. And they thought that they can change the government in Hong Kong, and that as a step toward changing the government in Beijing. And those people, for example, they keep talking about Hong Kong independence. And that's really, really ridiculous. And given the history of China, you know, having the colonialism for the last, you know, a couple hundred years, the Chinese are very sensitive about territorial integrity. And so, and those guys just got so extreme. I lived in Hong Kong for a long time. I was born here. And I've only lived in Hong Kong and the mainland of China and the United States. And so I've never been fearful on the streets of Hong Kong ever until 2019 during the riot. And it becomes so violent. You know, on January 6th, you had, you know, a day or so of a problem in one city. Washington, D.C. happened to be in a very important place. In Hong Kong, we're 7 months of that hell. And imagine all over Hong Kong, people were just wild and violent. And that is supported, obviously, by many people from overseas. And so Hong Kong people has, really been damaged by a lot of those kind of activities. And I'm not optimistic about Hong Kong as I am of the mainland of China.
Interesting you say that, Ronnie, because, as you were talking, you said two things to me. You said, living in terror, on the streets and being sort of terrorized by all of the violence. And, China's desire to, talking about territorial integrity. And I think that you asked me saying, I lived in China almost 33 years. And when I first went, China was a very, very different place from the rest of the world, certainly from America. And the more, as time goes on, it becomes more and more the same. And it just goes to show how China is becoming part of the planet, not, seeing itself as very different. Which country feels comfortable with the concept of somebody else interfering with their territorial integrity? To me, that seems like a very common thread that every sovereign nation feels. Which citizen wants to feel, petrified because of violence in the streets? Now, that doesn't mean that, our approaches towards, whether you want to call it, resistance or protest or something are very different. But I think these are universal fears, universal anxieties. I think what's different is our approach into addressing them. And that's the kind of approach I want to talk to you about, because certainly the approach that we have and that most Americans feel comfortable with is very different than the approach that Chinese people feel. And American policymakers believe that the policies that are tough on China are actually good for Chinese people and supportive for Hong Kong. So we've seen a lot of sort of actions being taken by the US government, even towards the chief executive of Hong Kong, towards officials of China. And I'm wondering if you think this, from your perspective, is smart policy. Is this the right way to help support the efforts and the things that the United States would like to see supported?
Absolutely not. I don't think that is the right way at all. In fact, you're just stirring up the patriotism and nationalism of the Chinese people against the United States. They can see as clear as day what America is trying to do by being tough on China. And, can we not respect one another, each other's culture, each other's history, each other's system, and let people choose? I thought that, Americans, we are the people that, give people freedom. And why don't we let other people choose their form of government? Why do we have imposed ours and say that ours is the best, yours is no good, so I need to be tough on you so that you can be like me? That doesn't, that's very un-American. But on the other hand, on international affairs, when you lose self-confidence and you think that the other guy is going to surpass you, then you have to say and do whatever crazy thing you have to do. And for example, they painted China as the threat of the world. China is not the threat of the world. China may be a threat in some areas of the leadership of America. That is true. And the question then becomes, what do you do with it? Do you compete or do you try to kill the other guy? And so, I think it's far better if we respect one another and live peacefully. I think that is at the end to the best interest of America by working with China rather than turning China into an enemy against ourselves, against America. That to me is really something that doesn't make sense to me. This is a confrontation that no one can win. China certainly cannot win, nor do I think America can win. And when that is the case, then why start the battle? Why start the confrontation, right?
Well, you pose an interesting question. Why start the battle? And, that comes back to actually one of the questions that, I'm asked all the time. And that is, can the two countries really be close friends and allies the way that, other countries share a common heritage to us in the West can be? Are the values that China holds and the people of China hold so different at a human level that it actually interferes with us becoming more close?
There are some truth to it, and there's a lot of falsity to it. For example, human being, as far as I'm concerned, is human being anywhere in the world. Whether you live in Europe, America, Africa, China, wherever, you want a better life, you want to have a safe environment, you want to have a family, right? You want to, to have a security and some reasonable standard of living. Now, that's universal. But on the other hand, some people do put value of its own, some value above the others. For example, in the West, individualism is very important. Individual freedom is very important. In China, because of the way Confucianism and its history and culture of 5,000 years, it is not as important as the group dynamics, the family, the unity of the society. And so, for example, in Chinese, I can hardly think of the word for rights. Human rights, rights. It is not used much in the Chinese everyday life. Rather, the word responsibility is used a lot more because you have to be responsible to your family, to your society, to the community. And so I think that, the individualism and individual rights, individual freedom and so forth, where it is good, neither can we go to extremes. Just like the Chinese should not go to extreme of the betterment of the group and hence 100% sacrifice of the self. That is also not good. So I think that we need to strike a balance between the two. So America should move away from individualism, individual rights and so forth. And the Chinese should move a little bit more from the collective kind of society to the paying more attention to the individual rights. But for one to say that I am the incarnation of righteousness and you are bad, that's not a good thing.
It's something that is very deeply ingrained. It's actually very hard for us to move away from things that are sort of core human values, and to ask people to change their approach is a difficult ask. So I'm curious, maybe let's switch to something. You made your mark as a successful businessman in property development and in engaging with China. And you said to us earlier that we better be very wary of what we read in the news. You said to us that you have to be, a lot of what you see in the Western media from your perspective is inaccurate. So my answer to that is, what are we supposed to do? People only have access to the media that they have access to. They can't read Chinese, and even if they could read Chinese, they wouldn't trust the Chinese media sources either. So my answer is we have to try to see for ourselves. And one of the best ways we've seen for ourselves is from the business community. And in the 80s and in the 90s, the business community took the lead, certainly far ahead of governments, in engagement, in saying this is a market opportunity. You saw the market opportunity for property development in mainland China. And I'm wondering, what's the prospect, because businessmen here have been coming back and saying there's been populist and nationalist sentiments, leaving neighbors feel insecure, making Western businesses feel like they thought they were on the right trajectory and now it seems to veer off. Can you give us your thoughts on this? Is that a part of history, the sort of opening up for Western businesses? Or can the financial sector in particular look forward to, or the property sector, look forward to easing up and to more opportunities?
Well, I was meeting with some friends recently, some businessmen from around the world. And this exact point came out, and that is, we are not, the environment in China is not like, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. I said, you're right, because 10, 20 years ago, China was bending backwards because they need the companies from the West. They need the technology, the capital, the marketing, the know-how, the management. They needed it. I used to serve on the board of Motorola for many years. And Motorola was given all kinds of goodies like everybody else, like, Dow Chemical or Boeing and Johnson & Johnson. A lot of them were, the playing field was never level. The playing field was very much in favor of the foreign companies. And as a result, they get used to it. And so now they're trying to level the playing field. And then there's yelling, hey, bloody hell, it's changing. Well, what you're saying is that there should not be a level playing field. Is that what you're saying? That's a reality. And so today, Motorola, if it is still around, cannot no longer do what it was once upon a time was able to do because the playing field is level. And China has evolved a lot, developed a lot in the last 20, 30 years. And so I think that one has to get used to it. Some industry don't get into China, right? Just like in some industry don't get into America. There's some industry that is just sort of off limits, right? Would a foreigner like to own an airline? You can hardly. Telecommunication and a few others. But apart from that, there's plenty of other opportunities to play. The same thing with the mainland of China. In many, many fields, not all fields, but in many, many fields, there's tons of opportunity. And I believe there will still be a lot of foreigners that will make a lot of money there. What is the most popular drink in China these days? Well, one of them is Coca-Cola, another one is Pepsi-Cola, right? So, hey, don't they make a lot of money over there? So, I think that, and from there, you can go all the way to the Boeing airplanes, right? So the smallest to the biggest. So I think that there's still plenty of opportunity, but let's respect the fact that, yes, it is now a much more level playing field than it was 20 years ago.
I think what you said is so important. I think that our perception lags across everything. And part of that has to do with the news that we're fed. But the perception that most Americans have about China is at least a decade behind. We're trying hard to remedy that, but it's also very hard, Ronnie, let's be fair, it's very hard for America that used to view itself as a leader to acknowledge that the planet has, a second leader now, and that, and how do we deal with that? But it also speaks to the fact that I started the conversation with that China's becoming more and more like the rest of the world, not more and more different. And if you look at its behaviors, whether it's from a regulatory perspective, which seem heavy-handed to us and a little clunky in some ways, but are becoming more and more like the regulatory efforts that we see in EU and in the US in many ways. And the obstacles and challenges that foreign companies face in, and the protectionist measures that they face in turn in China are becoming more like developed markets in some ways.
May I jump in just for a second? Because there's a question from the audience that I'd love to raise, and then I want to give you guys the last word. So let's do one question from the audience, and then James, you can ask your last question because we're coming up to the end here. So there's one question which says, "Thank you very much for the very thoughtful remarks. There are many countries that are quote unquote in battle with China, not just the US, from the EU to Australia, which had great relationships with China in the past. China has also changed, the wolf warrior diplomacy and the strong denials of all the human rights violations. Can you comment on this?" And another question is the sanctions towards the chief executive of Hong Kong. Those sanctions were lobbied by Hong Kong people, and the US legislators took actions based on those suggestions. Can you comment on this? So that's the one question from the audience, and then back over to you, James. Thanks.
Well, first of all, I know James for a long time. I know Dinda for a long time. If James is really a nice guy, okay, gentle kind of a guy. But however, if anybody who doesn't know him were to listen to news that says for the next 1 year that James is a terrible guy, he's a crook, he's a terrible, he has evil motive. And if you're bombarded with news of that sort for the next 1 year, everybody who doesn't know James will think that James is really a bad guy, right? So the rest of the world think that China is a bad guy. I think that, well, you mentioned Australia. I mean, AUKUS is probably one of the most foolish piece of diplomacy I've ever seen in a long, long time. And I don't believe the Westerner, and I've listened to Merkel and Macron and so forth, they are absolutely not like the way America is against China. Just that they have to, for the time being, because of NATO and so forth, play along. So don't be fooled that. As far as the wolf warrior diplomacy of China these days, I also think that is really, really foolish. I think China is missing a hell of opportunity right now. So as far as all those sanctions are concerned, I think that eventually most sanctions don't work. And I'm pretty sure all the sanctions that America is putting on China, eventually it will only make China stronger. Now, is that to the best interest of America? I don't think so.
why will sanctions make China stronger, Ronnie?
For example, you don't sell China certain technology. So China has no choice. They just have to develop themselves. And they produce more engineers than the world, than many other countries put together, right? So when you're forcing China to develop the technology faster in the absence of supply from the outside. And so I think that, the sanction and China has enough education and science and technology, and they're not as good as America in many, many things, but they have enough for them to develop from where they are today. And so I think that, I think it's really a foolish idea to sanction China that way. We are creating an enemy for ourselves.
Okay, well, now that we got into that, then how would you have the West respond to some of its concerns, many of which are legitimate from Western perspectives? If not by sanctions, what would be more impactful?
How about discussion? Why don't we try diplomacy instead of calling people names? If everybody calls James Heimowitz the thug of this world, and after 1 year, James, I guarantee you, anywhere you go, you'll be considered as a thug. Whereas we all know you're a good guy, you're a nice guy, right? And that's exactly what's happening to China. But eventually, I think the world will wake up to the fact that, hey, this is just America losing self-confidence and picking on China. And Australia, hey, sorry, some people count more than others. I'm a small guy, James. In front of you, I don't count, okay? So really foolish things happen.
Foolish things happen indeed. But I do think that the communications challenge is there. And this is what I worry about, Ronnie, and that is talking across purposes. You've just said how you feel. I don't know how we get Americans to better understand how China sees itself, never mind how it sees us. And that's why I'm so grateful for having somebody like yourself who's so bicultural and so fluent across sides, because I think what you've done this morning in the few little short time you've had with us was at least make me, and I'm sure many of the people listening, wake up and say, wait, America losing its self-confidence? Wait, is this really the way that people in Hong Kong and China view the relationship? Is this how? And I think that we get precious little insight into, we don't have to agree with it, Ronnie, but if we're supposed to engage with it and we're supposed to understand it, I think it's important for people that are participating today to understand, and we didn't have enough time this morning, and I'm sorry, but if that was to talk about the own sense of pride about being Chinese and the own sense of, China's place on the planet, whether it's engaging with the West or engaging with itself. And one of the things that I think will surprise Americans is China's not so concerned with how it engages with America. It's become much more concerned with how it engages with itself.
Right. And kind of last suggestion for China Institute. Why don't you bring a big group of influential Americans who have never been to China and visit China and spend 3 weeks there?
So thank you for that. We're actually in the process of doing that. He knew that. But can I tell you? We do that with teachers. We brought over superintendents and principals in the school district to give them access to understanding, because educators sometimes feel there's brainwashing, not educating. But we think that's really important to bring teachers and administrators. But many of the people that we approach feel that they'll just be subject to relentless propaganda. And my answer is, you'd be surprised at the diversity of voices that you'll be able to listen to and see when you get on the ground. We're not talking about...
is they don't know that they themselves, in living in America, is subjected to propaganda every day from your press, which is nothing that come close to the truth, and it is just political talk.
So I'm sorry to be the bad guy and jump in because of time.
I'm just going to say thank you. So thank you so much, Ronnie, for sharing that perspective and that insight. Because if a pure Chinese came on and said it, we wouldn't be able to hear it in the same way as we can hear it for somebody like yourself that's been so successful across so many factors. So thank you again. Sorry, Dinda, I just wanted to
It's a thrill to hear both of you, and this conversation is fascinating. I think my favorite thing from this discussion was Ronnie saying the question is, do we compete or do we try to kill the other guy? That, I think, is such an important question that the United States needs to answer. So thank you for your insights, Ronnie. And thank you so much, James. So it's now our great pleasure to turn to one sector, the green economy, where many Chinese experts believe the US and China should be able to find common ground, and where there should be business opportunity for both sides. With both countries prioritizing climate policies and the development of a green economy, there are both opportunities and also tremendous challenges, of course. So we have today two of the leading actors who are driving global progress on green finance, the green lending practices that are required to help force businesses to implement green practices. Dr. Ma Jun, I see you on the screen, welcome, is China's top green finance expert. He is founder and president of the Institute of Finance and Stability based in Beijing, and also the chairman of the Green Finance Committee of the China Society for Finance and Banking. And he has played a very leading role as co-chair of the G20 Sustainable Finance Study Group in international work on green finance issues. Deborah Lear is executive director of the Paulson Institute. Deborah, welcome, where she's been working on many important US-China initiatives, including founding and running the Institute's Green Finance Center. As I used to work for the Paulson Institute, I know how important their work is, and I am very honored to welcome the Paulson team to our event. And we're also lucky, very lucky today to have Damien Ma, another Paulson Institute team member who runs the think tank and who himself has worked on green finance. He helped publish Ma Jun's book on the subject, and Damien is going to moderate the conversation. So over to you, Damien, and thank you very much. We have a hard stop at 9:30, so I don't know if we'll have time for, I'm sorry, at 9 o'clock. And so I don't know if we'll have time, but if you want to type your questions into the Q&A, we'll try to get to them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dinda, and thank you to the China Institute. And it's great to be with you, Dr. Ma Jun and Deborah. I know, Ma Jun, we have not seen each other for a few years, so it's good to at least to get to see you virtually. And so I want to get this started because we do have a time constraint. So lately, what I've noticed, there's been tons of great news headlines. Just last week or even this week, I think President Xi Jinping announced a biodiversity fund and also announced 100 gigawatts of renewable energy project that I think shocked a lot of people. I saw just the other day that the Europeans in Brussels billions of dollars committed for green finance as a part of their post-COVID-19 recovery. And you've seen companies really taking on this green finance. And so maybe I'll go to you first, Dr. Ma Jun. Given that you're the architect of green finance, I would assume this is a testament of last year's, just amazing efforts over the last few years. And also at the Paulson Institute, we were sort of the first to kind of push this idea in the United States. So I guess for you, Ma Jun, where do you think things go from here, at least in the China market, given China's plans, 14th five-year plan? Where do you see green finance, I guess, progressing in the next phase?
Thank you, Damien. And I would like to say hi to Deborah, even though I haven't seen her face yet on the screen. But let me just touch upon the green finance topic in China with a view of how we implement the carbon neutrality pledge. As you know, that the green finance started almost like 7 years ago when we began to architect a framework with elements such as the taxonomy, disclosure requirements, incentives, and products, and so on. But really, starting from September last year, when Chinese President Xi Jinping announced the carbon neutrality target, that whole framework began to refocus on net zero. Because as you probably know, back 7 years ago, we were focusing on air pollution. A lot of the green projects were dealing with air pollution, water pollution, land contamination. But clearly, last 7 years, we had made a lot of progress on reducing pollution. In fact, in Beijing, 70% reduction in air pollution already. So it's a right moment, with our pledge for net zero. The green finance focus is shifting rapidly towards decarbonization. And just give you a couple of anecdotal stories. We just had a Green Finance Committee meeting. This is the China Green Finance Committee back a few weeks ago, and 400,000 people attended. Of course, most of them online, and it's a massive, mobilization of participation, attention. But the entire topic during that conference was on how to implement carbon neutrality, go through the green financial system. I think we're working in at least three sort of angles. One is revising the taxonomy, making sure that the green projects there are indeed reducing carbon. For example, the clean coal technology was removed recently from the green bond taxonomy by the PBOC. That's just one piece of evidence in that effort. And the second thing is on disclosure requirement. A lot of companies are beginning to calculate and report carbon emission, and the banks are now being required to calculate the carbon intensity of the assets. I was just attending a training program organized by PBOC yesterday, and we organized all the pilot program specialists for green finance coming into Beijing to discuss how to apply all kind of coefficients in calculating the carbon intensity of the loans they extend to the clients. And the incentives are going to be much more sort of geared towards carbon neutrality. And I'm expecting the central bank to announce a major facility. It's called decarbonization facility very soon, which will provide low-cost funding through the commercial banking system to decarbonization projects. Of course, there are many, many products that's popping up related to carbon. There are a lot of carbon neutrality bonds issued in first half of this year. In fact, largely because of that, the green bond issuance went up 181% in the first half of this year.
Wow, that's incredible to hear. 400,000 people. I'm not sure, Deborah, that we're going to get 400,000 people for a green finance virtual meeting in the United States. But to Dr. Mao Jun's point, we don't have a formal carbon neutrality pledge yet in the United States. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what's happening in the private sector, because I think that's where a lot of the action is in the United States. I noticed that in their Q2 earnings call, 150 of the S&P 500 companies specifically invoked ESG investing, which is environment, sustainability, and governance. So I wonder if you can talk about things like the TPG fund and what's happening in the private sector that's driving this concept forward, even without policy support specifically.
All right, well, let me start by thanking the China Institute for hosting this session on green finance, which really is the topic of, I think, the year. And as we look ahead, there are so many opportunities for potential cooperation between the US and China, but also for the US as a platform to regain its leadership in this field. In the previous administration, this really was not a priority from the top. We have seen Biden take now a whole of government approach, but there's a lot of catching up to do. And when we look to our colleagues in China, we see, just as we've heard with Dr. Ma, and hello to you, it's wonderful to see you. As we look at what China's doing, they have a very ambitious and aggressive plan. So in the US, a lot of the innovation and creativity and the really power of the movement has come from leaders in the private sector like a Larry Fink or even our boss, Hank Paulson. And Hank recently has joined and gone back into the commercial sector to join with TPG and the launch of this climate fund, Rise Climate. And what has been really interesting as a part of that, and Damien, as you talked about the importance of seeing more and more corporations getting involved in this, is that corporations for the first time who don't usually invest in private equity companies actually invested in this fund. And this really is a new trend, and it's part of their pressure that they're receiving, not only from their shareholders, but from where the regulatory structure is going, what their customers are demanding, and even what their employees are asking for is to see a more aggressive plan and transition to net zero. Just on the commercial opportunities, we see that there's a real opportunity in climate as business. And I say this, and let me just point out China as the example. Goldman Sachs did a study recently and is saying that there is a $16 trillion opportunity in the Chinese market for environmental goods and services. And as we see China continue to move in the direction that Dr. Ma was talking about, with the rise, with the whole industry now creating a framework for a transition to carbon neutrality, we're going to see all kinds of new innovations, new companies spring up as part of that. But there are also going to be a whole set of new demands, and the United States still is one of the leaders in clean technology. And so opportunities to sell into the Chinese market, to commercialize products in the Chinese market are still going to be large, and it's going to be a huge job creator for China. So the more that we see China opening that market, the more that our countries could be working together to do things to spur trade in green products, whether it's goods and services or technology, if it's infrastructure, through initiatives like the removal of tariffs on these goods and services, the better it is for all of us.
Truly, a tremendous opportunity. I mean, we're seeing, the three big markets, obviously the European Union, China, both have formal pledges, and the United States, hopefully we'll get a formal pledge soon, but even in the absence of which, we're talking about a very sizable portion of the global economy that's trying to move to, net zero. And so I guess going back to you, Dr. Ma, as Deborah said, there's obviously a lot of opportunities in the China market. What are some of the opportunities you see for foreign businesses in terms of financing green capital? Infrastructure might be a little bit tough, but are there other things that you think would be really interesting, whether it's tied to the 14th five-year plan, just so our audience sort of is unaware of what kind of China's strategic focus might be, that would be conducive to this kind of climate capital or green finance investments?
Well, lots of research reports coming out on opportunities arising from carbon neutrality in China. Deborah mentioned the number of $16 trillion opportunity in China. I think that's a very small number. I don't know which time period they're talking about, but we, named the China Green Finance Committee, just issued a report, as I said in the big conference, that in the coming 30 years, the green and low carbon investment demand is going to be 487 trillion RMB for the coming 30 years. It's bigger than most of the other estimates that we've seen in the past 1 year or so. We looked into 211 green sectors and estimating these sectors, how much demand is coming out, largely due to the carbon neutrality. So huge opportunity for the renewable energy, for electric vehicles, for battery, for CCUS, for low carbon technology in the steel, cement, aluminum sectors, and for tree planting. There are just hundreds of areas where we can collectively invest in China and also in the third countries, such as many of the developing countries. Now, in terms of a bilateral relationship between China and US on green finance collaboration, I have not seen much relative to Chinese collaboration with Europe and China collaboration with the UK. In fact, I'm the co-chair of China-UK Green Finance Task Force. I'm co-chair of China-French Green Finance Collaborative Arrangement. I'm co-chair of China-Europe-led taxonomy working group. There's so many mechanisms that's being built in the past couple of years. And we're developing a lot of, not only at the government level, but also sort of a business level collaborative arrangements. Just recently, we had one conference in Beijing. It's called China Europe Development Green Development Seminar, during which we talked about all these very sort of operational issues. How do we deal with energy issue? How do we develop green buildings in China, develop a green development zones or zero carbon communities, and then green finance. Now, on the green finance side, it's not just limited to any single country. If we have international collaboration, for example, China can package some of its 14 trillion RMB worth of green loans into ABS, and then we can sell to anywhere in the world using the common ground taxonomy, which are now being developed by China and the European-led working group. This common ground taxonomy will be out very soon because I'm a co-chair of that. And with that taxonomy, the Chinese green assets can be packaged in a way that's recognized by international investors without the need of double verification. And when we sell such green assets into the European market, American investors can automatically buy because you have a lot of presence in London, right? With American money. So I think it's a global, really collaboration, and we can certainly look into ways to collaborate more on bilateral basis. For example, back 7 years ago, I remember there was a green building which was done jointly by Chinese and American specialists and making it net zero. It's a big demonstration in China. It's very popular now. But really, I think it's a pity we don't have many of these kind of bilateral projects anymore.
Wow, that number was incredibly large. I mean that 16 trillion. I thought it was big, but I guess it sounds like there's incredible opportunities there, and I'm not surprised because what we're talking about fundamentally is transforming the underlying energy system, and that is going to be huge, and it's going to involve infrastructure and so on. I guess to that point, Deborah, just quickly, we're in the United States, we're obviously debating over infrastructure bill and Build Back Better. Is there a way in which green finance can help the United States not just build back better, but also build back greener? And also to Ma-Jun's point, what are some of the obstacles you see or possibly opportunities in furthering U.S.-China collaboration when it comes to green finance?
Well, the obstacle in the US at the moment is the politics around the legislation on the Hill, and hopefully we'll see that get passed. It's critical, not just to where we are when it comes to climate, but just to when it comes to the core of our economy remaining competitive, that we make sure that our infrastructure is sound. So hopefully that will get resolved before the end of the year. When it comes to cooperation between the two countries, certainly the person who has been most active and traveled the most to China since the beginning of the administration has been John Kerry. And he is very passionate about the work that he's doing on climate change. He has a very aggressive agenda. And even though there have not been direct results coming from the bilateral discussions, we certainly see on the margins of the discussion, whether it was in the context of the UN meetings or what's happening through the COP process and the CBD, as you were referencing earlier, China's making some pretty significant commitments when it comes to climate. And so the fact that China has decided to stop financing coal-fired power plants overseas is very significant. And that was one of the things I know that Secretary Kerry had been discussing with his Chinese counterparts. So we are starting to see areas of cooperation and starting to see progress in that area, even as other parts of the administration are trying to still determine what the overall framework is going to look like. And I would hope too, as USTR Tai is considering what her trade agenda is going to be with China, and we've only seen a glimpse of it, and it seems like it's more looking at implementation rather than any kind of new market access, that she would look at where the US is competitive, start to prioritize those as areas where she should be engaged in discussions with the Chinese, and push for something innovative like we were talking about earlier, of the elimination of tariffs on environmental goods and services to help promote trade in those areas between the two countries. I think creating that kind of foundation is really important because it's good not only for both of our economies, but clearly in helping both countries reach their goals when it comes to climate.
And so in the interest of time, and if we leave a few minutes for maybe one question, Dr. Ma, I wonder if I can ask you, We talked a lot about the China market, the United States, and also, the EU, three fairly developed. Well, China is sort of a hybrid, but in general, how do you think, green assets, green finance can take hold in some of the more developing and emerging markets that don't necessarily may not have as much? And is it through sort of the international financial institutions, or how do we get sort of other markets where they're going to be disproportionately affected by climate? Has there been some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I recognize that the developing countries are likely to become bigger emitters in the coming decades relative to OECD countries because their carbon intensities are quite high, and the pace of green technology adoption is relatively low. So if we don't help them, I think it will end up with a situation where the OECD countries and maybe China reducing carbon significantly, but many other developing countries began to increase carbon emission. So that's a issue we need to address through many channels. For example, the MDBs, they need to work much harder to help developing countries to mobilize global financing, local financing, developing the local green financial system, and by putting more resources on their balance sheet, as well as ability to catalyze private sector financing. And the second thing is really the big countries, including US and China and European countries, they need to devote more resources to help countries such as Central Asia, in African countries and other places. Just give you a few small examples of what we've been doing in China. My team was helping Mongolia to develop taxonomy, and they published it back 2 years ago. And then Mongolia helped, together with us, Kazakhstan to develop taxonomy, and they are going to have it very soon. So these are kind of capacity transfer. I think it's very, very needed, very much needed. And it's at a very low cost, but the impact could be quite significant because it helps shaping the entire financial system within a developing country. Also, I think U.S. China can play their own relative advantage. For example, U.S. and other OECD countries have cheap source of financing, while China have low cost green equipment, especially in the area of solar and wind equipment and battery and so on. So we can combine the financing together with the Chinese ability of manufacturing these equipment. We can more effectively help other emerging markets.
Okay, so we got about 5 minutes, and I got 2 questions. Let me see.
So Damien, while you're looking at the questions, one thing I'd like to just raise here too is the next wave, and we've looked at certainly the great progress that's been made when it's come to green finance on climate change. I do think, and China just announced a big fund, as you mentioned, that it's going to focus on biodiversity. And we need to ensure that as we're moving forward on as we're moving forward on climate, we're taking biodiversity into account at the same time. That with the dramatic loss of species that we're seeing both in the animal and the plant kingdoms, that we're very conscious that anything that we do to mitigate on climate also is not done at the expense of the biodiversity.
And also the concept of natural capital that we've also rolled out, to thinking about how to price actually nature, which is a very, very dramatic shift in conceptual thinking.
Yeah,
so I guess
very exciting one.
Yeah,
how we turn bees and trees and others into asset classes.
And so this question is somewhat interesting, and it may be for Dr. Ma or Deborah too, but their question is, what influence or power do think tanks, or kind of green focused think tanks within China have, and what role do they play in bilateral relationship? And Dr. Ma, you run a huge institute there on green finance, so maybe you can speak on that a little bit more.
I think think tanks can do a lot of things. I've been working within China, as well as in a lot of international platforms on green finance. I can feel very clearly that the capacities within the governments, within regulators, still relatively low compared to the demand they're facing. And the think tanks can do or provide a lot of value added to what the government are looking for. For example, the government may be good at publishing the guidelines and regulations and documents, but who is going to draft these? Who is going to organize all the experts to collect opinion? Who is going to do surveys and collect feedback from the industries? I think the think tanks can do majority of these works for the government, so we can speed up the process of good policy making. Without private sector help, think tank help, I think some of the governments may spend 3 years to come up with one big document. We can shorten that by 50% or even 70%.
Yeah, and on Damien, that I of course would like to think that the Paulson Institute has been helpful in this debate. Certainly, it's been a great pleasure for us to work with Dr. Ma on the green finance area.
And also, just as we talked about, for rolling out new concepts like natural capital. This final question, we got about 2 minutes. Maybe we can do it really quick. It could be for either of you. We haven't talked about the Belt and Road, and I think there's always been a lot of interest in China's BRI initiative. So the question is, are there U.S. companies pursuing anything green, vis-a-vis the BRI? And can U.S. companies export to China clean technology for that particular, big project? Is the question. I don't know if it's Dr. Ma or Deborah.
Yeah, maybe I'll start, and then Deborah will add. I was looking for U.S. institutions to join the Green Investment Principles for the Belt and Road, which China Green Finance Committee and City of London jointly launched together with many organizations, including Paulson Institute back a few years ago. But so far, our signatories are coming from, of course, China, UK, and most of the large European countries and many developing countries, but without any institution from the US. We did talk to quite a few big ones. They considered, but they said it was politically sensitive, and then let's think about that. So still, I think we have a gap in the participation of US institutions in green part of the Belt and Road initiative, which I think if the government, both Chinese governments can, form better relationship on climate-related issue and tackle the third countries, namely the emerging markets, in a positive way, in a collaborative way, I think we can contribute more significantly together with using Chinese and US resources.
Deborah, do you have anything to add? Okay.
Yeah, I would just add there are US companies who are actually being part of the infrastructure development along the Belt and Road who are supplying green products. And so, yes, there definitely are opportunities as part of that. I think as China is reconsidering where its funding is going along the Belt and Road, however, I think there will be changes in what the priorities are and where they're investing. So it will probably change how much US companies can participate in that.
Well, Dr. Ma, I know you have a hard stop, so I want to make sure we end on time. And it's been a great conversation, Deborah and Dr. Ma. It's a necessary conversation, and we have about $400 trillion RMB's worth of investments. So to end on a note of extreme optimism, get ready for a lot of activity and a lot of capital being deployed on probably one of the most important generational issues of our time. So thank you both, and thank you, Dinda, and we will end it right there.
Thank you all so much. Wow. I mean, firstly, before you disappear, we need to clone all three of you. We definitely need to clone all three of you, but especially Dr. Ma. I mean, Dr. Ma, when you're talking about being co-chair of the French Green Finance, co-chair of the UK Green Finance, co-chair of the European, et cetera, not to mention the work you're doing, leading meetings of 400,000 people in China. My God, you're a busy man. And I know you're all incredibly busy working on these important issues. So thank you for joining us. It's been extremely inspiring, a little bit anxiety inducing, just because I think we all feel the urgency of these issues, but also very hopeful. So thank you very, very much. And we hope to get you back again soon.
Thank you, Dinda.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dinda. Bye.
So we're now going to welcome some speakers who can share, building on that conversation, who can share what it's like on the ground in the sustainable business sector to get an idea of how all this policy is playing out in the marketplace. We just heard, Dr. Ma talked about the new principles that are being pushed down through the banking system and requirements for the banking system. And we're delighted today to have Peter Reisman join us, who's a managing director at Bank of China here in New York. And Peter is responsible for implementing sustainability initiatives at the bank. And so we will hear more about that. And thank you again to Bank of China for helping to sponsor this conference as well. So Marilyn Waite is managing director of the Climate Finance Fund, which covers the markets of China, Europe, and the United States. And so Marilyn, we're delighted to have you join us, I believe, from Europe. Thank you for being here today. We have Daniel Zhang, who is an executive director of Broad Group, one of China's most dynamic private enterprises, which is known especially for sustainable building practices. And you saw the video of Broad Group's work at the beginning of the conference. Again, Broad, we are very grateful for your support of this conference as well. And our moderator is also an expert on these subjects. Our moderator is Barbara Finnemore, an environmental lawyer who founded the China office of the Natural Resources Defense Council. So over to you, Barbara, and I'll come back in about half an hour. Please do type your questions again. So we will try to get to some at the end of the conversation. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you so much, Dinda. I'm so delighted to have this opportunity to hear from our panelists about how China's climate goals may be affecting the private sector's drive towards sustainability. And just to set the stage, we're really at a crossroads right now in terms of what China's climate goals are and how it intends to get there. Because so far, what we really have is Xi Jinping's pledge that China will peak its CO2 emissions around 2030, maybe before 2030, but we don't know when, and that it will reach carbon neutrality by 2060, but we don't know how. Now, China has pledged to release an action plan for how it intends to peak its CO2 emissions, and also a long-term plan for reaching carbon neutrality before the upcoming Conference of the Parties on Climate Change, which is starting in Scotland in just over 2 weeks. And China's also pledged to enhance its official nationally determined contributions before that time in terms of carbon intensity, how it's going to increase the share of renewable energy in its energy mix, forest coverage, and so forth. We also have the 14th five-year plan outline that came out in March, but it doesn't say very much about how China is going to actually move towards peaking carbon and carbon neutrality by 2025. But we expect more detailed five-year plans to be coming out for different sectors, including renewable energy and coal. So there's a lot going on that we're waiting to hear. But this all happens, of course, in the context of China's existing power sector crisis, which has done a lot of damage to China's GDP, but also increasing its coal supply rather than focusing so much more on renewables and efficiency. I remember when I first started working in China, actually 10 years after I started working in China, there was an enormous power crisis then, and China used that to really turn towards energy efficiency. But it remains to be seen how much this power crisis will affect China's determination to reach and strengthen its long-term climate plans. So in that context, I want to turn first to you, Peter, because even if the private sector really begins to push for green and sustainable supply in China, given the status of private sector in China, it's not really going to move the needle very far on reaching the climate goals, because state-owned enterprises still control the most important sectors of the economy when it comes to carbon, such as electricity, energy, carbon, coal industry, and financing of major projects. So it sounds like the government is now truly driving its green agenda through the state-owned enterprises. Tell us about the Bank of China's initiative to go green. And in your view, is this a big deal? Is this potentially very exciting news in terms of China's ability to meet its carbon goals?
Thank you, Barbara. So let me begin by thanking the China Institute for the opportunity to participate in this executive summit and on this panel. Bank of China USA was a proud sponsor of the summit and promoting dialogue, engagement, and an exchange of ideas and how better to really connect the two largest economies in the world. Bank of China is, as the largest or most international of the Chinese banks, which spans over 60 countries. This year, we're celebrating our 40th anniversary of operations in the US. I think Bank of China is in a unique position to pursue many green initiatives on its own, and we've supported the green initiatives of current, and we look forward to supporting that down the road for future clients. As mentioned, as you mentioned just now, and as mentioned in the last session, China did declare to the world at the United Nations that it will strive to peak carbon emissions by 2030 and achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. Since then, though, the Chinese government has published policies. They've further clarified some of their goals. There's certainly more to come in the coming weeks and coming months, but they have also started already putting out requirements in the financial industry. Bank of China's efforts in pursuing a green strategy is not new, though. The group has promoted the development of green finance, supported the growth of green industries such as energy conservation, environmental protection, new energy, new materials, really for quite some time. And I'll bring up some examples of that in a few minutes, but one can easily research and see the balance of green loans by the bank has increased significantly. The strategies are being put in place. The policies are being put in place. The procedures are being put in place by the banks all around and by the industries. The banks are also going to be tested. They're going to be tested by the regulators with new requirements coming out. And they're also going to be tested by partners and clients in terms of really how green they are. And we're already seeing that play out today. In terms of, is this big news? Is it a big deal? I believe it actually is. It's a very big deal. We need to lead by example. Banks and companies and markets are paying very close attention to these developments in and out of China, including Bank of China's most recent pledge to end funding for foreign coal mining and power plants. It's seeing a massive boom in developing green finance products, and we expect that to really continue in the coming months and the coming years. We heard in the last session numbers between $16 trillion and $487 trillion in terms of opportunities. But I can tell you in terms of our operations in the US, Bank of China, we have our own ESG working group. ESG is now the environmental, social, and governance, buzzwords going around on Wall Street. And we've taken a very aggressive approach to that by revising our policies, our procedures, and by going out into the market and finding these opportunities to support. It's challenging, though, because the standards are still developing and evolving. And that, I think, is probably one of the more challenging parts of what's going on today. Is really seeing where those standards go, both in the marketplace and in terms of what the regulators will be putting out there.
Thank you, Peter. It really is a fascinating time. And as you say, the goalposts keep changing and getting more developed. So I'd like to turn to Daniel now to see how it looks from the private sector perspective, because Broad Group has been a leader in sustainable building for a long time. And as Peter said, the Chinese government has come up with very detailed policies for certain sectors, including for sustainable buildings. But until recently, the banking sector has been incentivized to really work with the state-owned enterprises rather than private sector. So the private sectors has, like yours, has probably had a hard time in getting access to financing and projects. Now, is that changing? Or is it likely to change now that government's promoting sustainability more aggressively? So tell us, what challenges and opportunities do you see for Broad Group in light of the government's focus on climate and sustainability?
Thank you, Barbara. The challenge is always there. I think with the changing attitude of the government to attach environmental sustainable criteria to lending, that is a hope for private sectors who are heavily invested in sustainable practices. As our products, I can give a brief background of what Broad is. We have been in the United States for over 20 years. That there are many of our highlight projects with energy efficiency that Broad specifies in CCHP, which is combined cooling, heating, and power. And these systems or infrastructure and projects often happen outside of China. But how is China able to become the producer of, such as our company, to become the producer of green products is really to do with, of course, cheaper supply chain and of course, more widely available labor. But this is all changing, especially the rise of Broad. The company was founded in late 80s, but the growth happened in the 90s at the same time when power shortage was frequent because of the rising demand with industrial productivity. So as you can see in those days of power shortage, Broad has invented a type of air conditioning using absorption technology that doesn't use electricity. And so you can see that we have grasped the opportunity and have grown to, I think was #1 market penetration in China for cooling. And that has changed as the Chinese coal production with electricity production. So in the late 90s and then in the 2000s, electricity became so abundant to support the Chinese industrial productivity with cheap coal powered. And I think this is a cycle. And right now we are at another cycle, is that a global energy shortage with coal prices rising, with supply chain disrupted, and companies who have already invested in technology that don't rely on dirty coal. I have to use that word because coal is very dirty. It's our #1 enemy for climate change. So Broad has many track records, and we have the industrial production capacity. And about 10 years ago, we have started investing in producing modular passive house standard green buildings. And over the last 10 years, again, we have been heavily investing in it on the scale of $1 billion to research on modular construction. And right now we have the title. I can confidently say we are the world's fastest construction company. We can build a building 57 stories in 19 days. And very recently on CNN has showed our construction of 11 story in 1 day, in 28 hours. So it's 1 day, 10 stories. And we're trying to show that China has this productivity, green productivity for green products. But at the same time, that we don't, actually China doesn't have this market. Well, I have to say, unfortunately, most of Broad's green products, the markets are outside of China. They're in the United States, they're in Europe, because for energy practices or for green buildings, that better systems and more thoroughly engineered infrastructure. This is smart grids, for example. All of this are more sort of developed or say more accepted outside of China. And China right now is in the process. I think as a private company, we will start to see that state-owned, state-led projects to begin to adopt complex, sustainable green systems. So we're moving from green products to green systems and green projects. I think with green projects, banks can start lending to companies because banks cannot lend to companies just based on the company's shares alone or their technology alone. They often evaluate the future of a company in contributing to sustainable practices if you have many projects which are going to need this capital. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. I mean, I think it's fascinating to hear from practitioners on the ground in China and the rest of the world about both the opportunities and challenges, because I think a lot of our audience or people in the US don't realize how much innovation is going on in China, and also how difficult it is to break through the market, despite all the high sounding goals of the central government. There are a lot of challenges day to day. So thank you for sharing with us. And now I'd like to turn to Marilyn. Marilyn, you work on innovative finance and the systemic decarbonization of capital. So what financial industry initiatives are gaining traction and are ripe for uptake in Chinese market? What are the connection to the regulatory actions that I described earlier?
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you to the China Institute for having this conversation. Great to be with you as well, Daniel and Peter. I am sitting in Europe, and I must say to Daniel's comment about coal, I think gas is equally our problem. We have to move quickly towards renewable energy all the way around, including replacing gas. Thank you again. So in terms of the financial industry, what we're seeing, I would like to speak about a particular initiative that has gained real traction, especially in this post-COVID era, or COVID era, I should say, and that is PCAF, the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials. So this started with a bunch of Dutch banks and asset managers and asset owners coming together to harmonize the approach by which they measure and disclose carbon emissions of loans and investments. And it has grown exponentially over the past few years. So now there's over 50 trillion US dollars under management that are currently measuring and disclosing emissions, finance emissions, according to this international approach and standard. And so we have Wall Street banks, small credit unions, or cooperative banks alike. We have all across the globe, on every continent, we have banks and asset managers that are on board. In Asia, we have MUFG in Tokyo, CTBC in Taipei, Industrial Bank of Korea in Seoul. I mean, really growing. We don't have Bank of China yet, but I'm sure after this call, Peter will make that happen. But essentially, this is really the financial industry realizing that, wait a minute, we do need to have a harmonized, standardized approach by which we can measure progress. A lot of banks and asset managers have set net zero targets. We will be net zero by 2050. We will help our national governments achieve their objectives, right? And so how do we do that as the engine behind the economy? Well, we need to measure the carbon. It's kind of like, it's the carbon stupid. So what are the tons of carbon dioxide equivalent for a mortgage, for a commercial real estate loan, for a car loan, for project finance, for a government bond or a corporate bond? What is that? And that is something that we've seen taken off. And it relates to the regulatory frameworks, because now we see a lot of regulatory action. For example, in the United States, we have the Securities and Exchange Commission that have called for input on a proposal to have climate-specific disclosures. And so having listed companies and large companies, including financial institutions, needing to measure this and to publicly disclose it, they have to pull from the industry. What is the industry doing? What are the standards that are already out there that have the scale that's needed to drive this forward? Back in 2018, the China Securities Regulatory Commission, the CSRC, issued overall guidelines for ESG, environmental, social, and governance metrics. And so now is an opportunity to actually advance that further and to get very specific and very clear about climate. So scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So that's the emissions directly from operations, from purchased energy, and also from the supply chain. And if you're a bank or an asset manager, scope 3 is everything. Your core business is to finance the real economy, and so that is critical. So that's some of the things that we're seeing in the marketplace, and that is ripe for regulatory action.
Thank you, Marilyn. And Dinda, thank you for bringing Marilyn and Peter on the same panel, because I do believe that this conversation is going to move the needle, because what Marilyn is talking about a harmonized system of measuring and monitoring carbon emissions is going in the financial sector is going to be critical. And so let me turn to Peter now. You don't have to answer her questions, but really maybe talk a bit about the challenges you see in going green, with the standards changing, as you said, and in the absence of a harmonized system for monitoring and measuring emissions. Can you share with us, what do you see? Give us an example of a green deal that the Bank of China has been involved in that you think of is important in developing a new way of doing business.
Thank you, and I look forward to having that call with Marilyn after the summit. I mean, I alluded to this, early on in my comments. The standards are still evolving. We all know that right now, and in fact, it's a fascinating question because we're starting to see in the market there are these concepts that are coming out there of greenwashing and light green strategies, where certain companies may be making sort of false or misleading or unsubstantiated claims regarding their level of green initiatives, if you will, whether or not they're core to their strategy or not core to their strategy. And then on the other side of that, you have deep green strategies, and those are which green and sustainable principles are really fully embedded in the direct strategy and operations of the organizations. We just talked about certain standards. I know the Bank of China earlier this year signed on to the TCFD standards and the commitment to that in terms of future disclosures as well. But in terms of a specific example, I point, again, I like to point things that we're doing now, but we also started doing very early on. Back in 2016, we had a remarkably successful offshore RMB green bond issuance. The issuance was the first public offshore RMB green bond by any Chinese bank in the US, and also the largest offshore RMB bond by any Chinese bank overseas. Ernst & Young gave that issuance a deep green independent third-party rating, and the proceeds of that, of those funds, went to a variety of green energy projects, such as renewable energy, clean transportation, sustainable water and waste management. And we're constantly evolving right now. And so we're seeing more of these types of green financing, more bonds being issued and so forth. So it's an exciting period right now, I think, for the market and Bank of China. I think, again, I said it in the beginning, we want to lead by example. And we're seeing that, in terms of our guidance that's being put out by the head office. And we're doing that as we see ESG continue to grow here in the United States.
Great. Thank you. And we only have about 5-6 minutes left. So I really want to focus in on opportunities for greening business from each of you. But of course, I want to start with Daniel. Your entire business is based on sustainability principles. So what does that mean in terms of opportunities going forward that you see? And also, how do you get your suppliers to implement processes that are more green? And also, do you think the focus on sustainability is going to mean more competition for companies like yours?
Well, competitions are always good because it's no fun doing this alone. And to move everyone together to a green practice, I think the question with a supply chain, something that we have done on our own that really worked, I like to share, is that about a month ago, we published a half-year research study with 3 universities, Beijing, Hunan, and Hong Kong University. And we took one of our products, which is actually a project, the 11-story tower that was built in 28 hours, and to evaluate its life cycle carbon emissions. At the same time, we were talking to all our suppliers on what data they have on their products, on their raw materials, and we used mathematicians from these universities to calculate and created a very convincing report. So to explain, I think transparency is what's going to move everyone towards green practices for our supply chain and also for ourselves. And I think to move forward, the opportunity will be working with academia, and because everything we do from now on to avoid greenwashing will have to be scientific based. Thank you.
Yes, that's just exactly what Marilyn's been talking about, transparency. is the key for moving forward. So Marilyn, can you share some thoughts about challenges you see in climate finance and also what kind of new business opportunities you see?
I think the major challenge can be summed up by the word inertia. So we have built our entire economy on a fossil fuel system. Even the idea of the petrodollar, right, has, replacing the gold standard. So we have to really remove that inertia, get past it. And there are two ways of doing that. One is through disruption, and the other is through enabling solutions. So the disruption side is really where the startup kind of innovation model that comes in. And China has embraced that in many industries. I think there's a need and opportunity to link the private and public capital together with the technology parks throughout China, having dedicated accelerators for various climate change challenges like decarbonizing steel, cement, chemicals, and including climate fintech. So really mobilizing, using financial technology, climate solutions throughout China and the rest of the world. We see this already happening, for example, in ag tech with a lot of plant-based startups in China that are innovating and replacing a lot of the meat with other alternatives that are more climate friendly. On the second part, which is enabling, I think that is something that comes with regulation and the private sector coming together, including the state-owned enterprises, including state-owned banks coming together. One particular issue I'd like to highlight is around passive asset management. So passive investing, so this is not on the banking side, more on the asset management side and public equity side, is really growing. It's over half of the trades and securities trades in the US are passively managed, and it's increasing in mainland China. And so how do we make sure the default of that is decarbonized, is already using the equivalent benchmarks that are Paris-aligned, low-carbon, climate-friendly? Well, we already have the evidence. If you compare the MSCI China ESG Leaders Index with the MSCI China Index, well, guess what? The ESG, the more climate-friendly version of the index, performs better, has outperformed over the past 10 years and continues to do so in this COVID era. And so we have the evidence to do that. And so we need to have the regulation enable those defaults and then have the market adopt it.
Thank you. So in our last minute, we've got a fascinating question that's on everybody's mind. It's going to take me a while to read it, but I'll summarize. And it's about the current energy crisis in North China and the coal shortage that has led to more of a strain on the supply chain as the production gets damaged by supply cuts. So, and in the US, the standards have also had backlash from some in the business community. So what backlash might we expect from the Chinese business community, especially the vested interests like the Chinese coal companies and large state firms like steel production that are now having to pay more market prices for their electricity? Anybody want to tackle that real quick before our time is up?
Well, since I'm in China, I can share. I think these disruptions will be more and more often, and I think these disruptions are not necessarily bad. I think it's going to push us to innovate because necessity is the mother of invention, right?
What a great way to finish our panel. I love that. And let's hope that all these new opportunities come forward, even in a time of crisis, that we see a lot more innovation going forward. So thank you so much. And I'm turning it back over to you, Dinda. Thank you.
Wow, thank you all so much from New York, from Changsha, from Europe, from, I'm not sure where you are, Barbara, but we're so grateful to have your insights. And two little takeaways. One, Marilyn, so inspiring to hear you talk about inertia. I mean, I think that this panel and the conversation before this one are both going to inspire all of us to jump more deeply and more quickly as we can into these issues. And that's just incredibly important. And finally, Daniel, when you said the disruption will be more and more often, and that's a good thing, that leads to innovation, and that necessity, that innovation is what it's all about. So we're so grateful to all of you. Bank of China, thank you so much. We're inspired by the leadership position you're taking, and looking forward to seeing, where it all goes, going forward. You are in a position to move the needle, truly. So we're very grateful. Thank you so much for joining us. And we hope to get you back soon.
Thank you, Dinda. We look forward to it.
Dinda, take care.
Wonderful.
Dinda.
So I am thrilled now to be turning to some nitty gritty investment talk with some people who have deep on the ground experience in investment. We're going to first talk with Gary Rochelle, who, Gary, if you can adjust yeah, there you go. Perfect. With Gary Rochelle, who is co-founder of Qiming Venture Partners, has been one of the leading investors in China's tech and healthcare sector for a few decades now. So he's a real leader with deep, deep experience on the ground. And we're going to talk for a few minutes to get his perspective on what's going on broadly in China right now. And then we're going to have a fascinating conversation. He is going to have a fascinating conversation with a panel of 4 other top investors and experts. So Gary, thank you so much for joining us today. It's very early where you are, I think, on the West Coast. We're very grateful to have you.
No problem. Thank you, Dinda.
So Gary, there's lots of concern right now, as you know, you've been hearing of yesterday's conversations and today about the investment environment in China, with the government outlawing, I mean, I'm going to kind of oversimplify, but the government outlawing some businesses outright, such as private education tutoring companies, and interfering in the IPO market, regulating the tech sector more stringently, just to name a couple of examples. So I think we'd all really love to hear what your read is on what's going on and what sort of concerns you have or don't have.
Well, the numbers are interesting. China's invested a record amount this year in venture capital projects, both number of companies and cash invested, and that's both dollars and RMB. And so I think what's happening is there's just a shift in the focus. So where the government has stepped in, things that were in the consumer internet, e-commerce, and so on, education. That to me is about control of data and some insecurities that the government has, that perhaps some of those companies were starting to actually offer a kind of alternative leadership structure to the government, just because, Tencent, Baidu, and things, Alibaba, just because of their scale. So what you've seen a shift in the sectors to much heavier focus on core tech. So semiconductor investments are up dramatically, and that's not just in fabs or fabless design, but basically all the tools, the software and hardware components required to build a domestic semiconductor industry. Enterprise software investments are up dramatically because foreign software, whether it's Salesforce.com, Oracle, et cetera, that is really not welcomed as well anymore. So they're looking for domestic substitutes for that. That is a vast area because China really has not developed a large, strong enterprise software market to this point. So those are all things that are become more investable. Healthcare has expanded dramatically from 2.2% of GDP in 2005 to somewhere between 7 and 8%, depending upon where you talk to, heading to probably towards 12. So both directly and as just a factor of growth, that's also increased dramatically. So in advanced manufacturing, more manufacturing automation. So there are sectors that are absorbing capital at a higher rate than any time in history into China, actually globally, but also in China's venture capital industry. So it's hard to say that these policies have dissuaded the venture capital community on the ground in China from investing.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's fascinating. And I'm curious as to what you say to clients, though, because, a conversation with Fred Hu of Primavera Capital yesterday, he was asked about the sort of rhetoric, the sort of Maoist, neo-Maoist rhetoric that's coming out of China, which does, I think, rattle investors. So I wonder what you say to them. Do you say, just don't pay attention to the rhetoric, just look at the numbers? Or what do you say?
So it depends who you're talking to. So the message, China's entrepreneurs are used to this. The VC industry in China has always had a high degree of ambiguity. And so the startup companies now, they've been navigating the rocky shoals of dealing with Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, et cetera, and all the cross holdings that they've had for a long time. And so those became almost de facto government entities in the standpoint that if you were on the wrong side of Alibaba and couldn't use their channels, it materially impacted your business. So it was almost as if there was a government policy. that was getting in your way just because of their scale. The government policies themselves continue to evolve, but again, the Chinese entrepreneurs are extraordinarily good at quick reaction, responding to changes in the weather, if you will, and that level of ambiguity. The message to LPs is very different. So to investors in our funds, the message has been huge pipeline of IPOs coming out, far less obviously now in the US markets than in Hong Kong and the domestic markets. The issue is not going to be one of whether these companies can go public. The issue is the liquidity on the back end.
Mhm.
China has refused to make it as easy for its domestic markets to sell a company and then distribute the proceeds of those shares back to investors, especially in dollars. China's made that, continue to make that difficult. And so that's going to be the real change, is not the velocity of money going in, not the velocity of money being invested in entrepreneurs, but I think there's a dramatic slowdown in the liquidity on the back end, just because of the system that you have to deal with the Shanghai Stock Exchange, Shenzhen, Chinext, et cetera. So I think I think most of the Qiming LPs, the LPs that I talk to, they're not necessarily increasing. If they've been in China, they're not necessarily increasing their presence, but they're also not pulling back. So it's a little bit, let's wait and see.
Got it. So the exit strategy, of course, is incredibly important. So that's fascinating. So Gary, before we bring on your panelists, I wanted to ask you one question that's about something that's very near and dear to your heart. I mean, you host a wonderful annual conference called the Big Barn Dialogue with some of the top thinkers on China issues. And this year, one of the big themes was the question of technology and what the U.S. should be doing to protect national security, given China's technological rise. So my question for you is, do you think the U.S. is getting the right balance? Do you worry at all that the U.S. could lose out if D.C. imposes too many restrictions on cross-border tech investments and that kind of thing?
Certainly, right now, we're not in balance. I mean, the U.S.-China relationship is not in balance. China's system is evolving, and their regulatory environment for technology is evolving. I think the transition from Trump's administration to Biden, you see that there's quite a bit of consistency and continuation of some of the Trump policies, but I think the Biden administration is institutionalizing them more, but they're still not completely coordinated yet. So I would look at both sides, and on the China side, you see the Cybersecurity Administration taking over some of the responsibility for capital market listing from tech companies, from CSRC. So that takes a great deal of expertise and suddenly puts it in the realm of a group that doesn't have that expertise. You see the same thing on the U.S. side, not as much coordination as you'd like to see. So I think that the way that we think about it is right now, you do not have a balanced situation. Both sides are going through policy, thrashing around of policy, who has responsibility for different voices and decision making. And by definition, that's a messy process. So to an outside investor, so the public market investors, Fred, and the folks that you had on yesterday, the public market investors don't have the time frame that we have. Our average holding period of a company is 8.5 to 9 years. So we're going to go through one or two mini cycles with every single company in our portfolio. So we think about the time frame of reactivity differently than someone who's doing a lot of public market investing.
Got it. Okay. So let's bring on our panel. I'll first just introduce them and they'll come onto the screen. We're delighted to have Andrew Chung, who is founder of 1955 Capital, who invests in companies looking for solutions to global problems. And Andrew is also the former general partner of Khosla Ventures, so has very, very deep experience in the VC business. Curtis Ferguson is former head of Coca-Cola in Shanghai, and he is investing in the consumer sector and other areas at Ventec China. So he can bring us on the ground insights on the consumer world. Kerr Gibbs is president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, and he joins us also from Shanghai. And we've got finally Tu Li, who is a Beijing-based auto expert who advises on China's dynamic EV sector. So we're very delighted to have all of you. And I'm just going to quickly hand it over to Gary.
Thanks. Good morning, everyone. And thanks again for inviting us, Dinda. It's much appreciated. So, Kerr, I'm going to start with you, given the tone of and the theme that Dinda was asking me about, and ask you about what's the sentiment in the larger enterprises, particularly that make up the chamber, and how are you thinking about? How are they thinking about both the policy, and are they feeling the need to step back and pull away a little bit? Or are they still full speed ahead with their China initiatives?
Sorry, Gary, I lost you there for just a quick second. Have we've got the audio back?
Yeah. Okay. So can you hear me?
Hey, great. I can hear you now. Yeah, we just lost connectivity for just a quick second. I heard the front part of that, but not the back end.
Right. So the question is are the existing players on the ground that make up the members of the chamber, are they continuing to be full speed ahead on their investment plans in China, or do you sense some hedging and a pulling back?
Yeah. So what's the overall business sentiment of our members? Yeah, I mean, first of all, our members are mainly the multinationals, very different from your crew, Gary.
Yep.
Our group is largely made up of the Fortune 500 kind of companies, but we do have SMEs in our membership as well. I would say the overall sentiment, it's changed in the last couple of years. It's also kind of in sharp contrast with kind of the headlines that you see on China, in terms of the gov to gov relationship, which is just completely falling apart, and it's sort of every day is worse than last. Overall sentiment, though, is very positive, and companies are continuing to invest. We saw the last 2 years, given sort of the trade war and then COVID, things really deteriorated quite a bit. And one of the barometers that we use, Gary, is we have our annual survey, which actually just came out about a couple of weeks ago, and I'd be glad to share that with your audience here if anybody wants to shoot me a quick email after this session. Be glad to send out a PDF. But the overall, one of the questions that we ask is just looking out 5 years, are you fundamentally optimistic or pessimistic? And we like to ask that question in the same question in the same way, just in order to get a benchmark. And we generally are about 70%, something like that, in terms of our optimism level among the multinationals. In the last 2 years, it dropped 20-25%. Naturally, trade war, and then COVID. And so it's really bounced back up. Companies are continuing to invest. We're seeing a lot of positive sentiment really regarding 2021 in terms of what kind of revenue growth we're going to see, also overall profitability. The overall profitability in 2020 was actually surprisingly not bad. I mean, retail sector took a hit for sure, obviously because of Q1, but the bounce back was pretty rapid. So the two sectors we saw a dip in investments, retail and automotive in 2020, but both of those really have come roaring back in 2021. So we're actually seeing a fairly positive outlook, Gary.
It's interesting because there's a great deal of skepticism about the numbers that China publishes, whether the official numbers reflect reality. But I think you have to be a real cynic to think that American companies are actually misrepresenting how their business is in China. And I always view this as a wonderful checkpoint on what the feedback is on, well, you can't trust the numbers. Well, here you have these multinationals having this is what's happening, and having to explain that to shareholders. And it gives you a little bit of comfort that actually the bounce back that occurred in 2020 was very real.
No, you're exactly right, Gary. And we get that skepticism when we talk about COVID. We're on the phone a lot with people in Washington, D.C., and we talk about the specific things that China has done to control the virus and get businesses back up and running, whether it's retail or industrial or what have you. And we get that, Gary. We get people say, those are the government numbers on COVID, and you believe it? And frankly, we've been in this market a long time. We're just as skeptical as everybody else about what the government says about this and that. But look, I talk to the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies every day. These have tens of thousands of employees. If the COVID number was a lot different from what the government is reporting, definitely they would know. So no, there's we know what the situation is here. I mean, the economy is strong. Now, that's not to say that there aren't concerns. There are a lot of concerns, mainly about the tension between the U.S. and China, the export controls, the sanctions, the counter sanctions. All of those kinds of things really make people nervous and uncomfortable. But here's a fun fact for you. We just asked in our survey about the export control, the U.S. export controls, and said, is this impacting your business? About 45% of our members said yes, the export controls are impacting our business. Then we asked the follow-up question, what are you doing about it? Are you investing more? Or are you investing less? 20% of our members said they're actually investing more. Now, why is that? Right. So I think this follows on to a conversation from the last panel about the technology decoupling. And so if you're a multinational, if you are developing IP within the United States and you want to utilize that IP in China, but you are subject to export controls, that's going to be a problem. So if your main market is in China, and here I'm talking about automotive companies, but also other industries as well, you're going to react to the export controls to say, well, let me get my IP out of the environment in which it's being controlled. And so that's the answer to that riddle there as to why 20% of our members are reacting to the export controls by increasing their investment in China, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you very much, Kurt. So Kurt, I'm going to go to you next. Given your experience with a relatively small beverage company in China, few people have watched the evolution of the Chinese consumer the way that you have. So I guess there's a two-pronged question. One is, in general, both in the major cities and across second tier, third tier cities, which always struck me as kind of a strange description of the places that have 5, 10, 15 million people in them. But how is that evolving, and how has COVID impacted that? In terms of both what they're spending and then what they're spending on?
Great question. Just filled out Kerr's survey there. Just to echo what he said, Coca-Cola system has 51,000 workers, and we trace back 7 positive cases across those 51,000, all in Wuhan, all caught secondary from their parents over Chinese New Year's. So I guess going home from the holidays sometimes doesn't pay, but they all recovered. No, just, it's scary. It's getting so hard to tell the difference, as you said, between a second and third tier city. I literally just got off the train from Nanjing today. What's Nanjing got 9.3 million people. The economic development that's happening there. In fact, they're starting what they call the Software Valley project. Quite incredible, all government backed infrastructure. And they want to do a Silicon Valley. They're calling it a River Valley. And they have 3,000 companies already signed up. You know, China, you always have to put a zero at the end of every time you talk about a number, right? It's quite incredible. We actually, Ventec, who I'm with now, retired from Coke after 38 years. So I went from soft drinks to software. It's quite incredible that we've already invested in 7 companies there, and with government co-created funds. So the government's putting up seed capital money to start these companies, to once again try to propel them out. There's a lot of talk about the dual systems and what they're trying to do. Some of that's there, but also there's so much indigenous demand. I guess a case in point when you talk about developing the cities, first of all, the Chinese aren't traveling. Everybody knows that. Who is? A friend of mine runs Louis Vuitton. Their Chengdu store for Louis Vuitton now does more volume than the Champs-Elysees headquarters store. So, the consumer's back. It's back with a vengeance. They can, the barriers to entry for consumer goods here is so low with the whole digital economy. It makes it quite striking. So you got to get in early and figure out where the consumer is going to go, because they go there very, very quickly with a lot of money in their pocket.
So 2 follow-ups on that, because one of the things you mentioned to me is very interesting. So the Software Valley, the Nanjing, enterprises that they're putting in place. Sure. So you mentioned the co-creation or the co-investment vehicles that the government has. How strong are the people on the government side as investors? Because again, this is one of the myths that's often, which is there's a lot of really quote dumb money that's flowing into these companies. And our experience is a little bit different on the healthcare side than you might have on the consumer side. But what's your take on that?
No, I'm quite impressed with what I saw, and quite frankly, on the government side, they know they got to get a return. They know they're going to be judged by it. I think in the past, a lot of them threw some money around, but nowadays they're held to strictest measures. We went into it, quite frankly, with our eyes wide open, but we've been very surprised. We've been very surprised by the return also. So it's changed quite exponentially. The other thing which always kind of happened is that this money was always there and there was no place to put it, okay? They didn't have the software, they didn't have the people. What we forget also during what happened to COVID and visas being revoked and work permits and things such as that, there's now a huge amount of Chinese diaspora now coming back. And they've been US educated, they've been US employed. We see it on the venture capital side all the time. You know, the PhDs from pick the university in the US, always the best, and great work experiences with the Intels and the Apples of the world. And before they were going to start up a company back in the US. So maybe they came back for COVID, maybe they came back because their job was sensitive, maybe they came back, they couldn't renew their visa, and they've come back with a vengeance to start companies here. So there's really fertile ground. One, there's capital and people to utilize that capital, and we see a lot of it. And that's what really is what's driving our 7 companies we invested in a little district called Pukou. I had to visit it, but it was part of that massive infrastructure chain they're doing. So it's quite incredible. And I think they'll see great results from it. It's amazing what's happening in that area.
Do you have a sense that there's a strong feeling of we're going to recreate the software industry in China because we really don't want a lot of the enterprise software companies coming over from foreigners anymore? I certainly have that feeling from the Qiming portfolio that there's basically okay, we've used what we can to get to this point, but we want to have our entire own ecosystem.
I think in fact, it's funny you say that. You know, once again, a lot of people I'm dealing with have all been US educated. So their whole deal is also kind of, okay, let's coexist. What can we take from the best parts? Most all of them also want to have an eye on Europe and back to the US. You know, let's refine it here. We have a huge market, and how can we take it the other way? And, you know, one of them, I was on a panel today and I was actually challenging them saying, hey, one of Coca-Cola's largest R&D centers, in fact, the largest one in the world outside of Atlanta, is in Shanghai. Do any of them have that type of mindset that your second largest R&D center has to be in the US? You know, so they're still not there. I think they're a little safer going the academia route. Can they do some cross-fertilization that way? But I don't see any exclusionary things per se. More like, what can we do more? What can we grow more? What I see, the people we deal with are pretty internationalist in focus, and you know, in fact, they lament the fact that some of the things that they've developed haven't been able to export them like they thought they could. So it was a big discussion on how do we take this great investment. And you've seen you know, the digital infrastructure here. It's almost scary to be quite, you know, it's almost unbelievable, and how it morphs, and who would ever think that, you know, Pinduoduo is going to knock off, you know, Taobao. You know, it's those type of things, and how it just mutates. It's quite incredible. So once we can all travel again, you don't have to spend 14 plus 7 days locked up, which Kerr is doing right now. You know, you got to come over and because I think in those 21 days, Kerr, it's actually changed.
Well, yeah,
coming up on day 21.
Yeah,
I'm supposed to be in a quarantine right now, is what Kurt is talking about.
Yeah, it's not going to happen for me to be traveling much to countries that have 14 or 21 day quarantines. So, Tuli, let me switch over to you real briefly. So on the U.S. So there's the state of U.S. auto sales, U.S. automobile companies in China, and then there's the explosion of what's happening with electric vehicles and the competitive landscape there. So how do you see the opportunity as U.S. firms have been going in? What are they now running into in terms of this rapidly maturing ecosystem on electric vehicles? And then to me, EVs have always been the platform that lead to autonomous vehicles. So how do you think about those three components of the automotive sector in China right now?
I lost you
Gary,
toward the
Gary,
end
your
there.
sound just went a little bit weird there for a moment. So can you repeat repeat the end of that last sentence?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question.
There we go.
So when you think about the components of the automobile sector in China, so you have traditional autos, and that's what a lot of foreign firms are still heavily dependent on. But then you have this explosion of the EV sector, and that's gone now to dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of companies. And then that's now leading into what's happening with autonomous vehicles. How do you think about each of those components of China's auto sector, both from the standpoint of the technology, the investment side, but also how these are playing out and evolving in the market?
So I think that we can kind of lump these companies into three categories: legacies, the EV first companies, and then the tech companies. So the EV first companies like a NIO, like a Tesla, like they're crushing it right now, right? September, NIO and Xpeng got to 10,000 units a month for September. That's the first time that's ever happened. Tesla in China sold 52,000 cars. So the EV sector in China is going gangbusters. The CPCA originally forecasted at the end of last year that unit sales would be around 2 million for NEVs or new energy vehicles. That includes hybrids, but 95% of NEVs are BEVs. And so they had to revise that 3 times now to 2.2, 2.5, and now they're at 3 million units. And Q4 is going to go gangbusters. And so there's this dichotomy of chip shortage, but we're seeing, record sales on the EV level. And Kerr probably knows this, but it's causing anxiety with the legacies, especially the Germans, because the ICE sector is actually shrinking. And so the legacies are getting squeezed. Now, with regards to
What is
a
the
GM and a Ford, I think they
ICE
really
sector?
see.
I'm sorry, what
Oh,
ICE?
sorry, internal combustion engine. Sorry, guys. And so, because the legacies have to sell petrol engine vehicles to fund their EV future, and the squeeze on the ICE sector is causing a bit of anxiety. But with GM launching the Lyric in Shanghai later next year, and then Ford launching the Mach-E, so they're both going to be made locally. Ford is building the Mach-E in Chongqing with a joint venture partner, and then Cadillac is building the Lyric in Shanghai. So they really see a lot of optimism. I think it's the Germans that are a bit pessimistic because their first set of EVs aren't doing so well in the China market. And then you've seen 5 Series, A4s, and E-classes. Their sales have been reduced year over year substantially, double digits. And so there's a lot of optimism in the EV sector across the board between the legacies and the EV first companies. And then the unknown is the tech companies, because the Alibabas, the Xiaomis, they're all coming in with their own EVs in the next 2 or 3 years as well. So
one interesting question: China iterates more rapidly on innovation than any other country in the world. And so we're seeing that now with electric vehicles. Is there any doubt in your mind that the electric vehicles coming out of China will wind up dominating from a volume perspective, the global market? So as developing markets start to adopt electric vehicles, is there any doubt that China is going to be the leader in that?
I think that, so with regards to the United States, the Trump administration in 2018, I believe, put a 27.5% tariff on passenger vehicles that were exported from China to the United States. Biden has kept that in place. And so what we're seeing, or what we'll see eventually, because the United States is the second largest vehicle market in the world, right? So in 2020, China, I think, bought 20 million units, and then the United States was at 17. The EU, the 27 countries, around 15 million. So what we'll see is the EU and the United States are large enough markets where exporting is just a dipping a toe for these Chinese companies. But if they really want to be successful, they're going to have to build locally, right? And that means Canada. Well, let's just say it might be Canada or Mexico for the Chinese EV companies, but it's somewhere in North America. And so I don't see total domination. I see 3, 4, 5 brands that could do very well, BYD being one of them, NIO being another, but they all have their own challenges as well, right? Because we look at Tesla as kind of this startup EV company, but they're a 17-year-old company. Right. And if we think about emotional buys, there's two emotional buys in a person's life, a house and a car. So in order for someone to spend $30, $40, $50, $60,000, they have to be aware of the brand, the positioning, and then trust that brand. And so, so I think that's where these EV first Chinese companies will have to take their time when they enter Europe and when they enter the United States to really understand the market. And then establish that trust. But I don't see it being flooding the market with 20 brands in the next 10 years.
Interesting.
So one quick thing, Thule, just to say your Wi-Fi, the sound audio is going in and out. So while others are speaking, if you can sort of try to figure that out, it'd be great. Thanks.
Sure. Yep.
So one other thing, Thule, you mentioned the tech companies, kind of the autonomous vehicle cohort. Is that a tightly coupled relationship with the existing EV manufacturers, or are they going to all go down the path of having a completely autonomous or independent platform?
Well, I think right now they're all looking for dance partners, non-exclusive dance partners, but that's because autonomous vehicles, the actual end game, the robotaxi, is going to be a super expensive investment, right? And it's going to take multiple years. And so what they're looking for is someone to subsidize manufacturing the vehicle or subsidize some of these pilot programs. And so what I see is, so manufacturing is a pillar sector for China. And so EVs, I see that being exported. Where I see a bit of bifurcation is on the autonomous vehicle. And you can point back to the $300 million investment that GM made in Momenta, which is a China-based AV company, in late September. Because in the United States, GM has Cruise, and so what you'll probably see is that in certain features, autonomous being one of them, or adapted active driving assist systems, we might see a bifurcation because of the data, because of the connectivity. But yeah, autonomous vehicles are still pretty far away from a robotaxi standpoint, but there are other ways to generate revenue selling a service, level 2, level 3 ADAS into a vehicle, a la Tesla with its FSD, and GM with its Cruise, Super Cruise. So,
okay, thank you. So Andrew, moving over to you. So you've been at we've done some things together that we're at what we'd call bleeding edge investments. Some have even survived for quite some time and now seem to be thriving. But how have you seen the advancement of China's R&D capability over the last decade? We clearly have had an explosion of venture capital money going in. I think the results globally for the last quarter were 9,600 companies were funded, and $156 billion were invested globally in one quarter in venture capital, which would have made it the third largest year in the history of venture capital. But China's absorbing a good 35 to 40% of that. And so that clearly has to have an impact, that amount of money and that number of companies. But where you're looking at the really early stage investments that you've been involved in, how are you seeing this evolve, this capability evolve?
Well, I think it's what China is able to do from an innovation standpoint is underestimated, I think, by the West. China spends about 2% of their overall GDP to fund basic science and research around different categories like health tech, climate tech, the entire integrity of the agricultural system. And that compares to about 0.5% that the United States spends on that type of science and research. So just as a baseline, the amount of capital that the government and other private sources are putting into this type of R&D is phenomenal. And that translates into better research and opportunities for entrepreneurs to take a science experiment and use a 5 to 10 year period to scale it into a game-changing company for that market. One of the shocking statistics from a few years ago was that the Beijing Genomics Institute bought 1/4 of the entire world's sequencing capacity from Illumina in one order. They bought 127 sequencers in one single order, which again, just gives you an idea of the level of investment that the country is willing to do for these areas of research that are very critical to the country's future. Now, I will say that the scale of the problems in a lot of ways are also magnified relative to the United States and the West, which may be one of the reasons why this level of R&D is going in. One of the pandemics that happened before everyone was talking about COVID was the African swine fever. That was one disease that killed more than 300 million pigs in China. 300 million pigs in China is more than the total pig population in the United States. So if you imagine, for those of us in the US, waking up one day to a Wall Street Journal article saying that the entire pork population is gone in the United States, that would cause revolution. And so I think China is recognizing the scale of these issues, whether it's in the food supply issue or in climate and air pollution related or access to healthcare, a lot of these fundamental needs for the society, and they're putting significant amounts of capital behind it. And there's a venture capital ecosystem that is borrowing some of the lessons from the West that helps perpetuate these technologies to real commercialization. So it's quite a bit of activity and I think innovation that's happening that folks might not recognize outside of China.
So I'm going to go back around to everyone and ask this question. I'll start with you, since we're talking about the R&D capability and the early stage, innovation engine. If you had, and you do have, several $1 million, and you're going to invest in one sector in China today, or I'll make it easier and make it two, where would you put your money? What two areas do you look at and say, okay, this is going to have a 10-year run, and it's going to be highly lucrative during that period of time?
I was going to talk about energy storage and how it relates to the automotive revolution, but I'll let Tu talk a bit more about that. If I were to pick two areas, I think first, just building on the food supply issue and just the general breakdown in the agricultural system in China. I think ways of creating alternative proteins or foods at a much higher level of productivity becomes a very important survival mandate for the country. One of our portfolio companies, Nature's Find, which has raised about $500 million to build a food platform to be able to make foods from all the different food groups from non-animal sources, becomes something that could be very critical to that country's survival, because there's not enough arable land. The way in which they do the cow and pig farming is very difficult, even by American standards. There's not enough clean water to feed them. So there's a whole cascading problem around the food supply chain that really does need to be addressed. And I believe technology is one of the ways to do it. On the health tech side, I think one of the areas that we're tripling down on is in the surgical robotics area, or more generally, ways to provide access to equal healthcare to all populations in developing markets. And I think you mentioned earlier the second and third tier cities. Well, there's second and third tier cities that have tens of millions of people in them, but they wouldn't have something like what we would consider as a board certified or Harvard Medical School trained surgeon in X indication. And so if there's ways to use technology to allow remote treatment of patients, remote monitoring of patients, and in the example I mentioned, remote operating on a patient in a surgical context, I think that could be really important and powerful for the Chinese market.
And do you see those technologies existing today in China? I know Nature's Find is a US-based company at this point, but are you seeing those capabilities emerging in China?
I think that there's two different vectors that are going to converge because it is going to be a portfolio solution. Again, just the sheer scale of the problem is almost unimaginable to, I think, the American psyche. So they are going to have homegrown solutions. I think some of that is on the back of this tremendous level of R&D that is going in from the government and other private sources. But that is going to take a 5 to 10 year period to percolate and simmer. I think there are American and European solutions that are ready today and ready for the here and now. And so I think it is going to be a convergence of a set of solutions that are from the West, where joint ventures and partnerships will help facilitate that entry into China, and then a homegrown level of experience that is going to be coming in some cases, maybe even faster. And that development may take place over a shorter period of time. But again, the sheer scale of the problem and the government attention on the issues will foster better partnership opportunities, and it's driven by this survival-driven demand. So
interesting. So Tuli, if I asked you the same question in your sector, where would you put some money today? What would be the answer?
Well, I think Andrew kind of borrowed one of my answers. I think energy storage for sure. So here's a crazy statistic. 90% of battery capacity is in Asia. 80% of that is in China, and most of that is going to come from CATL. I think the United States is way behind on that. Volkswagen and Northvolt have announced 6 factories in the next 10 or 12 years. But another crazy statistic, United States will have in 5 years what the current capacity in China is for energy storage or battery cells. And then 10 years from now, or in 2030, China's going to have 10 times this. So it's these numbers are mind-boggling. The concern is going to be, and the second thing that I would invest in is EVs, right? Because there are a number of EV companies you had mentioned. There's a number of brands that aren't going to make it to the United States, but it's going to make everyone tougher. And the ones that do make it to the United States, they're going to have pretty good products. I think everybody is paying attention. Our American investors, Western investors, are mostly paying attention to NIO and XPeng because they're kind of the glamorous play. And of course, Tesla is the 800-pound gorilla, but without Tesla, it would be a completely Chinese EV sector. And so Tesla, although they're dominating in Europe and still dominating the United States, they're not growing as fast as the market right now here in China. So I think this is a pretty competitive market already. The concern I have with EVs and batteries is that it could become a steel or a solar panel. There could be overcapacity in the next several years, and there's going to need to be some protectionism in order to not dump those cheaper vehicles into the US and the European markets. Because the internal combustion engine and the petrol sector right now there's a ton of overcapacity. So there's not a possibility, there's a likelihood that there's going to be overcapacity in batteries and in EVs. And I think that's the concern. But for now, there's a lot of pent-up demand in all 3 major regions that need to be addressed. And I think the Chinese EV companies are well suited to do that.
So an interesting question is, I would agree with the capacity issue on EV coming out of China. But just like with solar panels, the entire industry ran at negative gross margins for about 6 consecutive years. But what that did is it allowed a much more dramatic installation base to occur globally in solar panels, which now when you look back, wasn't that a good thing? So yeah, so this is going to be, when you're looking at the global good, is a gross oversupply of EV manufacturing leading to very aggressive distribution outside of China. Is that such a bad thing? It's not going to make a lot of companies very happy, but is it not doesn't lead to a better solution maybe overall?
Yeah, and there's still a lot of investment in new types of batteries, so solid state being one of them, and then also in alternative. So if we increase range, if the battery management systems get a lot better, if and the Chinese company NIO is glamorizing battery swapping, right? And so battery cells might not actually need to be that innovative in the near future. So those are the things those are the wild cards that make me kind of wonder about that overcapacity a little bit. But you bring up a good point.
Yeah, and if I might chime in on that, we were earlier investors in QuantumScape and companies that are doing kind of a non-lithium approach. One of the dirty little secrets that folks don't talk about enough is that there's not enough lithium on the planet to power all the electric vehicles that we want to have. And so I think one of the limiters, Gary, to the overcapacity issue is that for the next phase, which is broader proliferation of electric vehicles, we're in great shape. I think that overcapacity is going to happen in the near term, and that's great for the world. But we are going to start to hit a point where the supply chain just doesn't quite work, and you can't get to the same type of broad, almost unlimited manufacturing to meet the demand like you saw in solar as you do in the battery and EV side. And that is an interesting longer term opportunity, I think, for us to keep a watch on.
So Kurt, going to your world, so there's two elements. There's the consumer side that you've known very well, but then you also mentioned the software investment. So in terms of where you're putting your bucks today, pick a couple areas where, and be as specific as you can about, this is where I would be investing and spending the time.
Yeah, well, to echo everybody before, we see EV trucks, tremendous amount of trucks. They do a lot of long hauling, short hauling here. We think that we can use a lot of that battery capacity in that side. In fact, there's a lot of plays here, but I think this is one of those hot potato deals. There must be 15 people coming to the office trying to talk about an EV helicopter solution. It's somehow we're putting people back on top of the drones. A friend has a Tesla and he has trouble having the driver plug it in. So they're going to have to make sure that reliability works a little better before you get up in the air. We're also looking at that next generation of consumption, which happens, at the end of the day, it's 1.4 billion people, but the per capita income is $10,000. And so what happens when that doubles? And I think Andrew had a really good point on the reliability of the whole food chain and, what happens there and who's supplying, because there's tremendous waste that happens. And, all the money that's lavished on sports and let's say in the US and the Western world, eating here is the spectator sport. So, we think there's a lot of things that are going to happen in that space, but it needs the whole supply chain needs to happen. And also same with healthcare, big investment in that. Andrew pointed that out. Right now, the hospitals, even in the best hospitals, I like how they call them out, hospital number one, right? It's triage to say the least. The guy's the average doctor is going to see, he's lucky to see 100 people an hour, right? It's unbelievable. And as the population ages, that's going to put a tremendous demand on that system. Now, some of them are getting really in front of it. We've looked at some nursing homes, et cetera. It's quite phenomenal. They're kind of set up on an investment type of thing. Same thing you'd see pretty much in the US with stages and advanced care as you go through the life cycle. But so that's another area where you're going to have a lot of people getting old very, very quick. The good news is they're all sitting on $2 or $3 million apartments somewhere in Shanghai. So there's a lot of disposable money will come out that way. So
we can spend an entire day talking about the real estate sector.
For health, don't get me started.
For healthcare, the strategy is, does it simply deal with one of my ailments? And my ailments are broad enough to actually cover an entire industry and an entire venture fund. And so that's my self-serving view. So Kurt, going to you, and then Dinda, if we have time, I'd open up for a couple questions.
Absolutely.
But so, Kurt, when you listen to this, again, you're dealing with the multinationals, but you also have a lot of smaller companies in the ecosystem of the various AmCham organizations and the policy groups and things that you sit on. How do you square the circle of what is a relatively enthusiastic perspective on what's happening with China's innovation capability and what's happening in the markets that we've been talking about, with the saber rattling and the regulatory framework that people are starting to face? How much of a problem is this, or is this one of the situations of it will simply deteriorate slowly until it starts to improve slowly, and so there's not a lot of reason to really be worried about it?
Yeah, Gary, I think there is a bifurcation here in terms of how well the multinational companies are doing and also the SMEs. This is becoming a more difficult environment for the smaller companies to work through. Now, having said that, I know this is the venture capital group, so you guys work with high growth companies by definition, but I think your SME and my SME are probably different. When you venture capital guys, talk about small companies, you're talking about high growth companies, future large companies, as opposed to sort of mom and pop and small services companies that I deal with in my membership. What we saw in COVID was a very different situation in terms of the survival rate of large companies that had sustainability and balance sheets that could sustain through COVID, and we did see a lot of washing out of the smaller companies. And China is becoming and it's a very business-friendly environment generally, but it is the regulatory environment is becoming more challenging for smaller companies. A couple of different ways. One is the export controls. The export controls, that is a difficult world to navigate. And if you're a large company, you've got rooms full of lawyers who can deal with compliance. If you're a smaller company, you just don't. And a lot of those companies are just going to stay out of the market. The other aspect is China's regulatory environment. I'll just give you one example. The tax regime, the personal income tax changes that are going to be taking effect in January of 2022. What's happening, I won't go through all the details, it's too boring for people, it's taxes. But essentially foreigners have been treated differently here in the China market with respect to personal income tax. They're going to be making some changes that are going to result in about a 30 to 35% hit on net income for people who have foreign passports in China. And that's just because of how they're the benefits in kind, how you can write off private schools and housing. So that's going to be, again, if you're a large company and you have some expats, but it's not a huge percentage of your overall payroll, you're just going to absorb that cost. You're going to be topping up your expats and keeping them whole. If you're a smaller company, you just don't have those resources to do that. So it's going to be a tougher environment for the smaller companies for sure.
Interesting. So what I'd ask is, there's a couple questions in the chat. One really addressed what we were just talking about, which is from the VC perspective. What's the regulatory environment going to be like when you think about that? So I might ask Andrew and Kurt to comment on when you're looking at the VC community, you look at money coming in, you look at potential regulation from DC on capital flows, China on capital flows. Why don't you guys both comment briefly in terms of how do you think about the regulatory environment as an investor? And Andrew, why don't you go first?
Sure. I think it comes back to a point you made earlier, Gary. For a lot of the things that we look at in the earlier stage venture timeframe, 5 to 10 year holding period, and in some ways it transcends an administration in the U.S. or congressional turnover in a way that doesn't affect us as much, and disproportionately affects much larger companies, Fortune 500 companies, and kind of the capital movements, between the two countries there. All that being said, I will say that there's a lot of what the regulations and the increased scrutiny does affect is board level perception, investor perception. So I'm sure I'm not alone here when I say that there are companies where the right thing to do is to explore a joint venture opportunity in China or Asia. And there are a lot of investors that are really skittish about it, even though the scale of the partnership is so small that it's not something that really would fall under any kind of regulatory regime. And so I think that does hamper things. I think that slows entrepreneurs in the US and in China from thinking more globally, because their services and their products are in many cases inherently global. And I think that is more of a near-term impact for venture-backed companies in response to the regulatory changes. But we do feel less of that because of the disproportionate effect on larger companies.
Okay, Kurt?
Yeah, a little unique for ourselves. We focused our LPs on major multinational companies, so that's a vast percentage of where we get our money. And and it's not huge stakes, I'll be honest, but they want to get that window on the consumer markets. Okay, so so one of the things is that they look at our deal flow. They want to put people on the boards. They want to look at being co-investors down the road. So when you're at fairly early stage where we are, which is A, B, the money isn't that involved with it. Actually, the knowledge is where they get in fact, the other day somebody said, "Where do I book the profits?" I go, "Well, that's a good thing to have, below the line. I don't care, put it in marketing." But so I mean, we've been quite helpful there, and we haven't seen really a diminish on the deal flow. The other thing too, but I think Kerr mentioned it, it's a little bit harder to get money out of here now. And a lot of companies have trapped RMB funds, and they're actually putting those to work. We've actually started an RMB fund here just to go ahead and take advantage of that. So they're going to end up with more RMB, but at least they'll have a deal flow to look at it. The problem in China, you get a great idea, and to scale it, it takes so much money, especially if you have an existing business, and it's a big dilemma for a lot of people. A lot of major multinational companies to really have an impact, to say, wow, do I really want to decrease my bottom line by 50, 60, 70 million bucks to put this thing out the door, which is a big investment in this day and age. You don't want to say a major country is, below last year because we made a big investment. So with all the capital formations coming on, I think a lot of multinational companies will have to get it's kind of created as the Chinese companies that they want to go to market in different categories.
Interesting. So we have time for one more question. There was another question in the chat, of which I'm not a big fan of SPACs. So I'm pretty much on the record as thinking that the world doesn't need too many more financial engineering instruments. And I saw how that kind of way. But there's a question: can we talk about the SPAC ecosystem in China? And do you think this will evolve in the future? And is it going to be more highly regulated? Is the regulation going to increase or decline over time? My immediate response would be regulation of everything is going to increase in China. I don't see anything indicating that regulations are going to decline. But would anyone want to offer, Kerr, do you want to offer an opinion in terms of what's likely to happen in the SPAC market in China, or what's happening in the financial markets?
Yeah, no, I'm with you on SPACs. I've been down that path before. No, I'm definitely with you. And I'm also with you on the regulatory environment. Is going to get more and more stringent as China really increases the level of control. I think what we saw was the derailed plan of making Shanghai an international financial center by 2020. That we saw the collapse or the abandonment of that objective. It's China is choosing for control rather than following through on that particular objective. So there's that. I'll answer the question a little different way. Let's go back to the fun question you asked before, Gary, and that I didn't get a chance to answer, which is what I invest in, fintech. I'm really surprised that hasn't come up in this conversation yet, because China is just innovating like crazy around fintech, and the retail banks are horrible, like the way they are everywhere, frankly. And so I think there's a lot of room. Having said that, we're in the throes of that right now, right? This tension between control and regulation versus the amazing amount of innovation and opportunities for building new products and new services in that particular sector. So I'm dodging the question just a little bit, but watch that space, and also watch that space again as U.S.-China relations evolve. Let's see if it's possible to have that innovation ecosystem really develop into a global one, as opposed to just being confined to China. But that's going to depend on geopolitics, and nobody really knows what's going to happen there.
Yeah, Kerr, that's a great way to end. And you're right about fintech in terms of total dollars. Globally, it's swamping everything else by several factors. It's remarkable. So Dinda, back to you.
Yes. Wow, you're right on target. It's exactly 10:30. That was a fascinating conversation, and I love ending on the point of the innovation ecosystem, which is something, of course, that Andrew talked about, the fact that we in the West do not really understand, we underestimate the kind of innovation that is happening in China these days. So thank you for sharing that. And a couple of other takeaways. One from Kurt, which is eating is a spectator sport in China. So I think the food sector is obviously, you've all been talking about the very serious issues that China needs to deal with in the food supply chain and all that. So that's obviously an important area. I think it's fascinating that Kerr said that the US multinational community in particular is still very positive on its business in China. And I think that's a message that we in the US do not understand. We really don't. So it's important for us to sort of hear from companies that are on the ground in China. That said, you saying that it's harder for the small guys because of the increased regulatory regime, et cetera. That's the conversation about the increased regulation are very important. But finally, you talked about the fact, you all sort of talked about the fact that psychology matters, the psychology of investors. And that may be something that's underestimated in China's, sort of speed in implementing these new regulations and policies and stuff, that, investors get rattled, and you've all talked about that. And so that's something you in the VC community have to manage, despite the, very real opportunities that exist. So thank you so much for sharing all these insights. Gary, you're a champ. Thank you very much for wrangling these brilliant people. And we hope to get you all back to our stage sometime soon again, hopefully next time in person. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
So, so our final panel today is going to focus on the mystery of China's next gen. These are the people who will truly determine the future of business opportunity in China. And this is a generation who, unlike their parents and grandparents, have really suffered zero political turmoil and virtually no economic hardship. So what are they looking at? What are they looking for in terms of products and lifestyle? To answer those questions, we have two real experts with us. Zach Deichtwald is the founder of the Young China Global Group, a real insider who spent many years living amongst and studying Gen Y and Gen Z. He's a real Zhongguotong. And Ma Rui is the founder of Tech Buzz China, which is an amazing, produces an amazing series of must listen to podcasts on the tech world in China, and lots of articles. And there's also a community for tech investors to, a place where they can congregate and share insights. So two amazing experts. And as Ma Rui watches the tech developments and companies, she's of course keeping a keen eye on what turns the next generation on in China. So welcome to both of you. Zach, I think I want to start with you, if you don't mind, to have you help us set the stage. You spent a lot of time studying and analyzing China's younger generation. How would you sum up how they're different from the generation that preceded them? This is the first generation that grew up in an era of no political turmoil and dramatically increasing prosperity. So how are their consumption patterns different from their parents' generation? And what sets them apart from Gen Z in the West?
Sure. So first, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to taking part in this. I think to start us off, you have to talk about generational power. If we were to be having this conference and discussing the last generation in China or the older generation in China, we'd be talking about efficiencies. How much can someone manufacture in a month? The ability to consume, the ability to have global investors care about who this generation is, what they want, what keeps them up at night, what excites them, what they think is sexy, what they think is exciting, where they want to travel. That's all new. I was looking at my notes here, and I literally have cat consumption in China has raised 10% this last year. The fact that we're talking about that, and the fact that that's a major headline.
They were talking about cats as pets, okay?
Cats as pets, exactly. Oh, that's a very important point. And right, even a transition, by the way. The global generational impact potential of this generation makes them the identity generation. The older generation, to sort of think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, was about moving from subsistence to existence. They were eating bitter so this younger generation could eat hot pot. I love the last comment that eating is a generational, or excuse me, a a spectator sport. This generation is the first generation that was really able to engage in that sport in a real way, which is why the global investment community and business community is so interested in them. I think second, something that I think we'll focus on today is pride. In 1990, China's per capita GDP was around $300. This generation has lived through China's rise. They've lived through the transition of foreign being equated with better, which is truly what the older generations believed, to what you're seeing now, which China is on a level playing field, be it politically or in terms of commercial capabilities, increasingly level. We're talking about parity, not equivalent, and that's new. So that mind shift is massive. Again, we're focusing sort of on the business implications here. Now, how do they change, or how are they different from their global peers? I think the biggest difference, again, is that in their actual ability to disproportionately impact the consumer markets. So in the United States, as much as we love to talk about millennials don't really have money. If you look at who's actually making trends, it's millennials, but boomers are still moving markets. In China, because of the demographic situation, you have this inverted pyramid. You have very few young people, more old people. I think of it as intergenerational financial fluidity. If you think about that inverted pyramid as a funnel, it's a funnel for resources, it's a funnel for attention, it's a funnel for love, it's a funnel for opportunity, it's a funnel for dreams, it's a funnel for pressure, absolutely. But if you're wondering how this young generation is able to buy and spend despite lower incomes than their global peers, it's because the older generations in China are helping to finance the dreams and lifestyle of this younger generation, which allows them to disproportionately impact the consumer marketplace, which is, again, why everyone and their mothers, it feels like, is talking about what does this young generation in China want.
Wow, that is just so fascinating. And I have to say, Zach, as usual, you are such a great cultural translator. You really are. I'm so grateful for that. So Ma-Rae, let's just sort of, build on that. I'm really curious to hear from you what you think the good life means for this generation.
Yeah, well, first of all, yeah, I agree with a lot of what Zach has said. And I think maybe to even make it more detailed, I think one of the great examples I heard actually pretty early on in my career from another friend who studies Chinese youth is that because, as Zach was saying, the GDP per capita has gone up so much from 1990 till now. In China, you have not just generations, but you almost have sort of hyper generations where every 5 years the economy changes recognizably, and the consumption patterns are different. So even within Gen Z, in China, you talk about people who are born after 1990 as being distinct from post 95s, as distinct from those who are born after 2000. For these people, again, because they've been in a era of plenty and not really experienced any hardship. I mean, even the great financial crisis wasn't very hard in China. You see that their conception of the good life is that they're very optimistic generally. Of course, the economy has slowed down a lot, so I think there's some wavering. But I think overall, if you compare it to Western counterparts, you do find generally that there's this belief that, tomorrow will be better. And I think also you see that the similarities there are many similarities between Chinese Gen Z and the West. And some of those similarities are there is increasing awareness of the environment, of sustainability, of having the good life not just be consumption, right? Because a great example is people who were born in the 1980s, like myself, probably remember when their family got their first automobile, because it would be a very big deal. But people who were born after 1990 in China, a lot of them, if you ask them, they don't know, because they live lives much more like developed countries, where you take a family automobile for given. It's no longer a big deal to go shop for your first car, and that way, in that way, they take a lot more things for granted on the material side and are more focused on, as Zach was saying, sort of the higher echelons of spiritual self-actualization, things that are beyond materialism. And now, as I was saying, focus more on the environment, focus on sustainability, focus on cultural pride.
That's so fascinating. So actually, I want to pause on that for a second, because we had a couple of panels earlier in the day about green finance and about sustainability in the business sector. And I'm really curious, when you're saying that there's an increasing interest and concern in the environment and sustainability, those kinds of things, does that translate into, do young people actually think about, okay, I'm going to buy this thing because I like it, because it's being marketed to me as an environmentally sustainable thing? Is that happening already or not so much?
I can talk about briefly what I see, and maybe Zach can jump in. I think that is definitely happening. You see that especially with the higher end brands, right? So again, we're simplifying a little bit and lumping all of Gen Z into one category, but
Right.
you do have sort of the more developed coast and then the poorer inland regions. So for especially, I would say, Gen Z who are living in the first tier and new first tier cities, that is definitely something you're seeing a lot showing up in marketing.
Zach, you have any other?
Yeah, happy to weigh in here. So first, I think what Mare just said about making sure that we don't lump is very important, because what we've seen over this last year is something that I would describe as a hollowing of the middle. We've seen that globally, and China's definitely felt that. I think when we talk about young people in China, they're so exciting as a consumer engine that they're driving luxury sales, they're driving international travel back when international travel was a thing. They're driving domestic travel. They're all of this real estate consumption. Where are they thinking? We're focusing really on the top quarter. And so when you're thinking about regulation and when you're thinking about what people want and sort of how the government is responding to that, it's really important not just to focus on the consumer class, but to also focus on the political class, who maybe isn't making a huge dent in somebody's P&L, but they are making a really large impact on the sort of psyche of the nation. So you definitely have a large amount of optimism. I think the winners are winning more. I feel like Donald Trump here saying that, but those who are being more successful within the economy are really feeling their success. But those, it's like what Kerr said in the last session, those who aren't are being washed out. The smaller players are being pressured, and they feel a huge amount of anxiety. My book just came out in China, and so I've been doing interviews at night. And literally last night, the journalist who was interviewing me said that he had moved home because of the financial pressures of living in a big city have just reached a fever pitch. So you definitely have this optimism, but there's this real trend of anxiety that also shows up in consumption. To answer the EV question quickly, I think a good example is Wuling, the green, ecological awareness.
Yeah.
I think it's less than what you see in the West, but I think the innovation that you're getting around it is really substantial. So 70% of Wuling's, Wuling makes a very small compact EV. They're under $5,000, very popular in second and third tier cities. Mare actually kind of had me focus on them a little bit more a few months ago. And the fact that 70% of their consumers are young people, they're specifically targeting young people. They're targeting these young families that are starting up in second and third tier cities. And that lifestyle decision to live more ecologically conscious, as well as not to necessarily move to a first tier city just because, is a set of sort of ideological, again, lifestyle, who do I want to be, how do I want to live decisions that the older generations might not have been making.
It's so fascinating, that social change, just as economic change, happens so much faster in China than anywhere else in the world. Social change does too. And social, sort of, mindsets, as you were saying. So Mare, I'd love to ask you to talk a little bit more about the empowerment of women as well, because that's got to be, especially with the younger generation, has to be a big change in terms of, business opportunities.
Yeah, we've seen really, so I'm 40 this year, and I think people in my generation, the post 80s generation, again, we were stuck with, expectations that women should be married by 27. That was the, year you became a leftover woman if you weren't married. But it's become obviously much more socially acceptable to be single, to be focusing on your career, right? So actually women contribute 41% of China's GDP. That's a higher region than in most other places, including North
41%?
America.
41%.
41,
Wow.
yeah. Yeah, and then China is actually home to the most women entrepreneurs in the world. So there's this report that called Huren report that comes out every year, and he talks about like basically the new billionaires in China, right? And then so China actually this year had 24 in just 2021, and it accounts for 2/3 of the total self-made women billionaires in the world. So I think that progress we've seen, women taking up more and more entrepreneurial roles, accumulating wealth, becoming more independent, less restricted to just, getting married and focusing only on their families. That trend is definitely here. And I think it's really accelerated actually in the last 5 years. I read a lot of celebrity gossip. I focus a lot on entertainment in my spare time. And I noticed like very clearly, like 5 years ago, and it's totally not okay if you are an actress and you're a single mom. But nowadays, there are some famous actresses who've come out and said, like, I'm divorced, or actually, I never got married, but I have a child. And the outpouring of support is actually, much, much more intense than I would have expected. And I think it's become much more normalized. So what that means in the business sense is that there's just been, because women are staying single longer, accumulating their own wealth, there's a lot more products that are more focused on helping women, organize their personal finances, live in single households, and yet still, acquire real estate. And I think this entire actually single economy is on the rise. Although I guess right now we are specifically talking about women. I think women for women, that is a relatively new thing.
And you mentioned actually when we talked last time, the idea that even in the food restaurant sector, single eating alone is now a sort of a new, segment of the restaurant culture.
Yeah, because there are 200 million single people in China, and over 90 of them live alone. So then that's a pretty substantial part of the population. So in order to accommodate these, you see things like F&B, where this is actually already common in Japan. It's just starting to become more popular in China, where it's awkward to eat alone, right? So instead of having these tables that are clearly not for singles, there's more noodle restaurants that have just like these cubicles where you can just sort of eat by yourself and not feel bad and be surrounded by other people who are doing the same thing.
Yeah. So actually I wanted to ask you both to talk a little bit more about how, I'm curious, maybe I'll start with you, Zach, the question of national pride that you mentioned, and just pride. I mean, not necessarily national pride, but just people being proud to be Chinese, et cetera. I'm curious as to how you advise companies and investors in terms of how to navigate that if they're from outside of China. Does that mean, does the younger generation, do they want to be buying Chinese products, or is that not something that comes into their calculation?
So I think a popular misconception is that national consumption is driven by nationalism, versus national consumption is driven by Chinese companies who know their market better, who are communicating on the platforms at the frequency and with the sort of attention to detail that their consumers want, and that the quality of their goods has risen significantly over the last 15 years, truthfully. There's a number of companies who went in the 90s and early 2000s who have been banking on this reputation of foreign being better. And the problem with that is a lot of national brands have copied what's made those companies successful and then iterated on them. I think the ability to iterate fast is one of the things that we always talk about as being uniquely Chinese. We don't consider that the rate of communication that Chinese companies have with the young consumer and the ability to iterate based on that communication is far greater than what these global enterprises are able to do. I talk with a lot of young people who work at these global companies, these global brands, and as cool as it is It's very cool to say you work at a global luxury house when you're actually in China, and it gives you a lot of social cachet. But one of the most frustrating things I hear consistently them describe is that they spend half of their job trying to keep up with the Chinese market and Chinese competitors, but another half of it they have to spend explaining to headquarters what's WeChat, why are they on Xiaohongshu, why are they spending money this way? And so the frustration of not being able to iterate and keep up at China speed, as well as that China fitness, the ability to communicate on the right platforms with the right KOLs, capitalize on the right trends to create the right memes to get the right set of attention. It's very difficult for foreign companies to keep up unless they're really empowering their local teams. So when I think about these global companies, I think first, are they empowering local teams, or are they just getting sort of outside consultants and ticking a box and being like, yes, we have WeChat exposure, but they're not really that involved. If they're not doing that, then they are absolutely going to lose out to increasingly competitive, competent, I would say proficient Chinese competition.
Tell us a little bit more about the pets thing that you mentioned. Zach, you mentioned cats, but so Ma-Rae, both of you have in our previous conversations talked about the rise of pet culture.
Yeah. So when I moved to China in 2007, I got a cat right away and a dog, and that I was probably more of a rarity, even though I was living in downtown Shanghai, and there were definitely pet owners. But now it's just become much more common. In fact, in 2019, the number of pet dogs and cats in China finally exceeded that of the US. Granted, there is a fivefold population difference, so it's not like on a per capita basis it's the same. But if you're familiar with China and you think about how really no one had pets, in 1980 really, to now where there are more dogs and cats in China than the US, I think that's actually quite a big difference. And you do see that show up, right? In the last decade, the so-called pet economy. So, food, toys, supplies, healthcare, right? Veterinary care for pets. This entire sector has grown by 20 times. And the amount of money that's in this sector is expected to be about 70 billion in 2023. And just for reference, the US being the largest market is only like a little over 100. So China is very fast catching up, and it's generally considered one of the fastest growing. I mean, you shouldn't even say considered. It is the fastest growing consumer category in China. And you see investment houses like Hill House put one of the biggest funds in China put a lot of money into this sector.
Zach, you want to jump?
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to frame this a little bit. And I literally do have the note that there was a 10.2% rise in the amount of household cats in China this last year, which is a wild thing to have to write down when you're preparing for a panel like this. But I think it's important to frame it because this shows up in work culture. This shows up in the sort of lying flat phenomenon. Yes. And that is this question of what's worth it. What is a life for? I think one of the defining characteristics of the older generation was the idea that more money is better. Again, it's that transition from subsistence out. And so the aim towards working more hours. The older generation created the 996 work culture, but they didn't complain enough to actually have a name for it. It was just embedded in what was to be working in China at the time. Yeah. The fact that there's so much attention being put on to quality of life is a luxury that the older generation didn't have. And again, it goes back to this identity question. A lot of people in this young generation are asking what's worth it. Would I rather create a family or try to buy an apartment in Shanghai? Or would I rather move it to a second tier city, buy a cat in a larger apartment and live like a king or queen? A lot of these lifestyle considerations, where do I put my money? How do I want to spend my time? It's a major departure from what China was. And it's not just being played out by, again, the sort of winners within the economy who can afford to have the good life. You do have a number of young people who are just tired of feeling like a disposable unit in one of these large tech companies and moving back home. They're tired of grinding in Beijing and sort of being an anonymous person on a massive subway, roiling towards work in the morning, and they want to live a better life. So they're moving and they're starting their own sort of sustainable farm at home, selling product online. I think this lifestyle transition and for which lying flat, which got a huge amount of media attention, I think of sort of like the silent rebellion against the culture of pressure that's so defining of the project of childhood in China, that you have part of the economy or part of the, part of this group of young people, again, leaning more into that pressure and working harder and creating more and innovating and, all of the fun headlines of China's economy of the future. But you have another part of this generation who's tired of it, who wants to live better. They want to have a cat, they want to put it on a leash, they want to walk it by the canal at night, and other lifestyle joys that a less stressful life can bring.
Yep, absolutely. So I'm curious, I see a question from the audience, and then we have time for one final question from me for you. But so there's a lot of optimism that life will get better and that the economy will grow. But what about the reaction of sorry, hold on. This is another question. It's a question about Tongping. So you know what? I'm going to skip it. You've really answered the question about Tongping. So that's great. You just answered it very, very well. So thank you for that. I am curious as to, given the emphasis that you're both talking about in terms of lifestyle, people reassessing what they want out of life. Ma Rui, what are the sort of investable trends for VCs in China? What are they talking about now that we're heading into 2022?
Investable trends. Well, in terms of course, people moving to less material focused and more, other aspects of life, more balanced lifestyle. What we talked about earlier, companies serving tourism, serving like live streaming now, the gig economy, sort of more jobs that are not so career ladder oriented and focused on 996, but jobs that allow people to be more expressive of their personality, and the economy that springs forth from that. These are all definitely things that we've seen in China actually is ahead of the US on, right? So specifically the influencer Wang Hong economy. But I think the most interesting, this is not necessarily an investable trend, but like an insight about what's coming out of China that is for Gen Z, is that I think what we're seeing is that China is the first mobile native large economy that's happened in the world, right? The US is obviously the largest economy, but if you consider the fact that US had very sophisticated PC infrastructure, whereas China did not, and China was able to really leapfrog to mobile, that's actually more common in the rest of the world, right? Definitely true for developing countries. And what you're seeing is that Chinese Gen Z, because they're also the first mobile native full-on generation, a lot of what they're enjoying and a lot of the trends that we talked about earlier, I'm seeing it being exported to all over the world, right? So I do office hours with entrepreneurs all over the world, and a lot of them tell me that they're not interested in looking at what US Silicon Valley companies are doing because they don't think it's applicable, especially if they're consumer facing. They're looking at what's going on in China, not necessarily because China has the exact same infrastructure or system, but it's much more comparable because the consumption habits, the infrastructure, the mobile ecosystem is much more similar. So you see TikTok being one of the best examples. That's something that caught on with Gen Z in China. And now is, as you can see, really taking over the world. You see platforms like Shein, which was the top shopping app earlier in the US this year. That's really taking, I would argue, just taking Taobao, what Gen Z in China are used to, the amount of change in the platform, the number of SKUs they drop every day, the speed at which things go from design to being delivered. All that is stuff that Chinese Gen Z have been benefiting from and enjoying for the past 5-10 years. And now that's being exported globally. So.
Wow. Yeah. Zach, did you want to jump in too, or?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with Ma Rui. China is greenhousing digital trends and digital technology that should be going global. I wrote about this recently, but everyone should be considering how to copy the copycat. And a lot of America's biggest tech has already started doing that. if you look at what Facebook's doing, if you look at what Amazon's doing, they are not, a lot of what they've been doing in terms of figuring out how to create better experiences for their customers, it's not original. It was incubated in China with the most digital first set of users in the world. The other theme, so a lot of, what Maureen and I have actually discussed separately is basically two large themes. One is Chuhai, which is which Chinese companies or even Chinese ideas, which we just discussed, are going abroad. And the other one is Xiachuan, so which is the sort of sunken markets in China. I think there's this perception that because of the tiered city system, that culture and what's cool and what's popular cascades down from the first tier cities to second, third, fourth, and fifth because of the verbiage of first, second, third, fourth, fifth tier cities. I think that's a misconception. And so when you're thinking about what's cool, what people want to wear, how people want to live, and lifestyle decisions, I think a lot of global organizations and global investors make the mistake of looking towards first tier cities, expecting those trends to translate to second, third, fourth, and fifth tier cities, when rather you should be looking at second and third tier cities to see what sort of subcultures are bubbling up there. We do this really exciting report, subculture study, each year, and you're seeing how a lot of what's bubbling up in sort of smaller cities, I say smaller, they're bigger than any American city, is starting to spread around the rest of the country in a way that's far more viral and appealing because of that cultural proximity between second and third tier cities versus first tier cities, which are kind of cultural anomalies within China.
We have to call it quits for today because we're past 11 o'clock, but wow, I want to thank the two of you. These to our audience, these are two people you need to be talking to in terms of getting insights on the Chinese market. I want to have office hours with Ma Rui, and I also want to have office hours with Zach. So everybody should be getting in touch with you both. Thank you so much for sharing those insights. And one of the real sort of, I think, important takeaways to what you've both been talking about is kind of this, what always strikes me is the similarities between what's happening. You'll probably think this is a ridiculous oversimplification because there are so many differences, but just the fact that young people in China, in many ways are acting like young people in the West because they have a degree of affluence that they've never had before, and so they're looking for answers to questions like, what is the meaning of life and what do I want my life to be? So obviously there are still tremendous differences, and everybody should get in touch with you guys to continue probing what the differences are and how to tackle the market. So thank you for joining us. We're really grateful. And that wraps up our 2021 Executive Summit. I hope you've all learned a lot. I certainly have. And the biggest takeaway, I think, for me is that there's nuance on the ground in China beyond the extreme rhetoric coming out of Washington and Beijing. And that as the two largest economies in the world, we need to find ways to continue this dialogue. As Wang Huiyao started the conference by saying, let's talk. And I'm grateful to all of our speakers for sharing their insights and talking with us yesterday and today. And I'm very grateful to all of you for joining us and listening to what they had to say. I hope you will all sign up to become members of China Institute and support the work we do. As I think you've seen, it's very, very important work, and we can't do it without the support of wonderful people like you. So for those of you who have signed up, we look forward to welcoming you in person to our networking reception this evening at 5:30 p.m. at China Institute. So we'll see you there at China Institute, and hopefully we will see all of you again soon at our many programs on business and arts and culture. So thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you again soon. Thank you.